I had always thought that getting away from the noise of the city would be good for me. The kind of break that pulls you out of the daily grind and dumps you somewhere quiet, calm, and far from people. Somewhere like a cabin deep in the woods. When I found the small, rustic cabin for rent online, it seemed perfect. It wasn't fancy, but that was part of the charm. It was isolated, off the beaten path, surrounded by trees, with no neighbors for miles. The pictures showed a simple wooden house, a little porch, a stone chimney, and a gravel driveway. No cell phone service, no internet, no distractions, just nature. I packed my bags, loaded my old pickup with enough food, water, and supplies to last a week, and drove out early on a cool Friday morning. The highway led me to a narrow, winding road that cut through dense forest. As I drove, the trees grew taller, the shadows longer, and the signs of civilization fewer. My phone lost signal halfway there, which was expected but still a little unsettling. I reminded myself that was the whole point. Disconnecting. The last few miles were on a rough dirt road, potholes shaking the truck with every bump. At one point, I stopped to check a map because the GPS was useless. The forest seemed endless. Eventually, I saw the small clearing where the cabin sat, surrounded by towering pines and thick underbrush. It was quieter than I expected. No birds, no wind, just a heavy stillness in the air. I stepped out, breathing in the cold, sharp air that smelled like earth and pine needles. The cabin looked better in person, worn but sturdy. The wood was weathered gray, the windows dusty but intact, and the stone chimney showed signs of recent use. I grabbed my bags and carried them inside. Inside was simple but cozy. A small kitchen with an old stove, a table with 2 chairs, a wood stove for heat, and a living room with a couch and some shelves full of books and old magazines. The bedroom was tiny, just a bed and a small dresser. The bathroom was a composting toilet and a small shower stall. There was no electricity, but lanterns and candles were scattered around. The whole place smelled faintly of wood smoke and damp earth. I spent the first few hours getting settled. I chopped some firewood stacked outside, cleaned up the fireplace, and started a small fire to warm the place. The crackling flames felt good against the cool air seeping through the cracks in the walls. Outside, the forest was dense and darkening as evening fell. I opened the windows to listen. There was a distant sound of a creek and the occasional rustling of leaves. I thought I heard some animal noises too, maybe a deer or a raccoon. As the night grew darker, the cabin felt very small and very isolated. I sat by the fire, eating canned beans heated on the stove, reading a book by lantern light. The quiet pressed in on me. No city hum, no cars, no other people, just silence. Not the peaceful kind, but a heavy silence that felt like it was watching me back. I went to bed early, thinking the next few days would be quiet, maybe boring, but relaxing. The mattress was old and lumpy, but decent enough. I kept the fire burning low and closed the windows tight to keep out the cold. Around midnight, I woke up suddenly. The house was colder than before, and the fire was almost out. I heard a soft tapping noise on the window. I froze, listening. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't rain. The tapping was deliberate and slow, like someone knocking. My heart pounded as I slowly moved to the window and pulled back the curtain. Nothing was there. I waited a long time, staring into the dark woods beyond the window. The moon was a thin crescent, barely lighting the forest floor. No movement. I told myself it was probably a branch or some animal, and tried to calm down. I refilled the firewood, relit the fire, and went back to bed, though sleep didn't come easily after that. The next morning, I decided to explore the area around the cabin. I put on boots and a jacket, took a backpack with water and a flashlight, and set out into the woods. The forest was thick, with moss covering the ground, ferns growing wild, and tall trees blocking most of the light. The air smelled damp and fresh, and I heard birds and insects. It felt alive and different from the silence of the cabin. I walked down a narrow trail I found behind the cabin, trying to get my bearings. The trail was rough and overgrown in places. I saw animal tracks in the mud, deer probably, and the occasional broken branch where something had passed through. After about an hour, I came to a small stream with clear, cold water running over smooth stones. I filled my water bottle and rested by the bank, listening to the gentle rush. Something about the woods felt strange, though. The deeper I went, the more I noticed the silence returning. Birds stopped singing. Even the insects seemed to vanish. The forest grew unnaturally quiet again. I felt eyes on me, or maybe I was just imagining it. I turned back toward the cabin. On the way, I spotted a small patch of disturbed earth near some thick bushes. It looked like something had been dug up recently. I knelt down, inspecting it closer. There were some broken sticks and leaves scattered around, but no clear signs of what had been there. Just a fresh patch of dirt in the middle of the undisturbed forest floor. I shrugged it off and hurried back to the cabin before the light faded. That night, I was more alert. I kept the fire burning strong and checked all the windows and doors repeatedly. Around 2 a.m., I woke again. This time, the tapping was louder and more insistent. It wasn't on the window, but on the door. Slow, steady knocks that made my skin crawl. I stayed still for a long time, holding my breath, eyes wide in the dark. The knocking stopped suddenly, leaving a heavy silence. I didn't dare move until dawn broke, painting the room in weak gray light. During the day, I decided to reinforce the cabin. I nailed some wooden planks across the windows and barricaded the door with furniture. The whole time, I felt uneasy, like I was being watched. Every shadow seemed alive. Every sound made me jump. The food supply was running low after 2 days, and I needed to get more from the truck parked at the end of the dirt road. I told myself it was just paranoia, but grabbed a hunting knife and a flashlight before heading out. The drive back to the main road took longer than expected. The dirt road was worse after the rain, slippery and muddy. When I reached the truck, I noticed the back window was smashed. Shards of glass glittered on the ground. My heart raced as I scanned the area. No sign of anyone or anything. I checked the truck's cabin. Nothing was stolen, but the glove compartment was open, and my flashlight was gone. Whoever had broken the window must have taken it. I felt exposed and vulnerable. I didn't want to drive back to the cabin, but I had no choice. The woods were quiet, too quiet. I kept the truck running, doors locked, eyes on the trees. Suddenly, I saw movement in the trees. Something large and slow, barely visible. It disappeared quickly, but my pulse hammered. I turned on the truck's headlights, scanning the dark forest edge. Nothing but shadows. I sped back to the cabin, mud flying off the tires, heart pounding with fear. Back inside, I locked everything again and sat by the fire with my knife on the table. The rest of the night passed without incident, but I didn't sleep. I listened to every noise, every crack in the wood, every rustle outside. On the 4th day, my water filter broke, and the food was almost gone. I needed to leave, but the truck was stuck in mud near the cabin. I tried to push it, but it wouldn't budge. The isolation felt suffocating. My mind raced, imagining people or something lurking in the woods. I tried calling for help on my phone, but no signal. I spent the day digging around the tires, trying to clear the mud, but I was exhausted and scared. That night, I stayed awake, watching the windows, hearing every tiny noise. Around 1 a.m., I heard footsteps outside. Heavy, slow footsteps moving around the cabin. My breath caught in my throat. I grabbed the knife and crept to the window. Through the darkness, I could just make out a figure standing in the trees, watching the cabin. It didn't move or make a sound. Then, after what felt like an eternity, it turned and disappeared into the forest. The next morning, I packed what I could carry and started walking down the dirt road, hoping to find a way out. I left the cabin behind, feeling relief and regret. The woods were still heavy and silent, but the open road felt like safety. After several hours, I reached a small ranger station. The ranger was surprised to see me, but helped me call for a tow truck for my truck and drove me to the nearest town. Back in the town, safe and surrounded by people, I felt a weight lift from my chest. The cabin trip had been supposed to be a peaceful retreat, but turned into something else, something darker and real. I never learned who or what was in those woods. No signs of anyone else around, No footprints except mine. The first time I saw the cabin, it looked like a perfect little place to escape. I'd been craving some solitude away from the city noise and the constant stress of work, and this cabin, tucked deep in the woods, seemed like exactly what I needed. The listing had said it was remote, off-grid even, with just enough amenities to survive comfortably but no distractions. That was the main selling point for me. I wanted to disconnect, reset, and get away from everything for a while. When I finally arrived, the late afternoon sun was already dipping behind the tall pine trees that crowded the narrow dirt road leading to the place. The air was cool and crisp, the smell of damp earth and pine needles filling my lungs with a sharp freshness I hadn't breathed in months. The cabin stood on a small clearing surrounded by thick woods on all sides. It was old, made of weathered logs with a stone chimney and a rusted metal roof. The front porch sagged slightly, but everything looked solid enough. Inside, it was just a single room, maybe 20 by 20 feet. A small kitchen area was on one side, with a rusty wood stove and a few dusty shelves. The furniture was basic: a rickety wooden table, 2 chairs, and a cot pushed against one wall. A small pile of firewood was stacked next to the door, and a tiny window faced the clearing outside. There was no electricity or running water, just a hand pump well outside near the back of the cabin. It was everything the ad promised. I set down my bags and took a deep breath. This was going to be a long weekend of silence and solitude, the kind of quiet that seeps into your skin and makes you notice things you never did before. I wanted to spend the next few days hiking the nearby trails, reading old books I'd brought along, and just being alone with my thoughts. After unpacking, I decided to gather some firewood before it got dark. The forest floor was littered with fallen branches and dry pine cones, perfect fuel for the stove. I picked up the biggest pieces I could find and stacked them carefully near the cabin door. The sky was growing dim, the last colors of sunset fading to gray. I could hear the rustling of small animals in the underbrush, the distant calls of birds settling in for the night. Back inside, I lit the stove with some kindling, and soon the cabin was warm, the flames casting flickering shadows on the wooden walls. I made some instant coffee and sat down at the table, looking out the window at the darkening woods. The trees stood like silent sentinels, tall and dense, their black shapes etched sharply against the pale sky. That first night, I slept on the cot under a thick blanket. The sounds of the forest were strange and unfamiliar. Twigs snapping, the rustle of leaves, occasional hoots from owls far away. It wasn't scary exactly, but it reminded me how small and exposed I was out here. I felt something like unease mixed with awe, like I was seeing the world from a different angle. The next day, I woke early and brewed some coffee over the stove. I planned to hike a trail marked on the old paper map I'd found in the cabin's drawer. It showed a loop that went past a small creek, up a ridge, and back down through the forest. I packed a small backpack with water, snacks, my phone, just in case, and the map, then stepped outside into the bright morning light. The woods were alive with sounds, the chatter of birds, the buzz of insects, the distant gurgle of running water. The trail was narrow and covered in pine needles, winding between trees thick with moss and ferns. I moved slowly, taking everything in. The air was cooler here under the dense canopy, and the smell of damp earth was stronger. After about an hour, I reached the creek. It was a narrow, clear stream, tumbling over smooth stones and fallen logs. I sat on a rock and dipped my hand in the cold water, watching the current swirl around my fingers. It was peaceful, but I also felt a growing awareness of how isolated I was. There were no other hikers, no sounds of engines or voices, just the forest and me. I followed the trail up the ridge, the path getting steeper and rockier. The trees thinned out near the top, and I stopped to catch my breath and look around. The view was stunning, endless waves of forest stretching in every direction, fading into misty hills on the horizon. I felt a rush of satisfaction, like I'd found a secret place the world had forgotten. The sun was climbing higher, and I knew I should head back before it got too late. The trail descended through thicker woods, twisting around tree roots and stones. I kept my eyes on the path, careful not to trip. The forest felt different here, darker, quieter. I started to notice small details I hadn't seen before. Broken branches snapped sharply, piles of disturbed leaves, and the faint smell of smoke carried on the breeze. I stopped and looked around. The forest was still, but something didn't feel right. It was a subtle change, hard to explain. The usual sounds of birds and insects seemed muted or gone. The underbrush was too still. I felt a prickling at the back of my neck. I quickened my pace, following the trail back toward the cabin. The sun was lowering now, and long shadows stretched between the trees. As I walked, I noticed more signs. Flattened grass patches near the trail, broken twigs that looked like footprints, maybe from a person or animal. My heart started to beat faster. Suddenly, I heard a sharp crack from behind me. I froze and turned slowly, scanning the trees. Nothing. I started walking again, faster this time, the hairs on my arms standing up. The forest felt oppressive now, like it was closing in. The sky was fading quickly to twilight, and I still had some distance to go. Then I heard it again, a rustle closer this time. I stopped and listened. My breath came out in quick, shallow puffs. Something was definitely moving in the trees nearby. I considered calling out or using my phone, but there was no signal out here. I had only my wits and the fading light. I picked up a sturdy branch from the ground and held it like a club. The path seemed darker now, and I felt a cold sweat on my forehead. I told myself to stay calm, to keep moving toward the cabin. The forest was not a friendly place after dark. After what felt like an eternity, I broke through the last line of trees and saw the cabin's dim outline against the sky. Relief washed over me like a wave. I rushed the last few steps, threw open the door, and slammed it shut behind me. Inside, I locked the door and bolted the windows. I piled firewood against the door for extra security. My hands shook as I started the stove again and lit a lantern. The warm glow filled the cabin, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, watching. I sat at the table, gripping the branch tightly, eyes glued to the windows. The forest was dark and silent again. Minutes stretched into hours. I listened for any sound, any sign of movement. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I decided to leave. I packed my things quickly, grabbing what I could. Before heading down the road, I looked carefully around the cabin and clearing. The ground near the door had fresh footprints, too big and deep for an animal, and too erratic to be from any normal human visitor. Some prints were smeared, like whoever made them had been in a hurry or injured. I walked back down the trail, the sun warming my back. The forest was bright and inviting again, but I couldn't forget the fear I'd felt. I made a promise to myself never to come back here alone. As I reached my car, I looked back at the trees one last time. The woods looked peaceful in the daylight, but I knew better now. Sometimes the scariest things aren't ghosts or monsters. They're the real, dark places in the world where you're alone and vulnerable. And sometimes people or something else are out there watching, waiting for the right moment. That cabin was supposed to be my escape. Instead, it was a reminder that some places hold dangers that don't need magic or monsters to be terrifying. Just silence, darkness, and the knowledge that you are utterly alone. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. After the chaos of work and city life, the chance to escape to a remote cabin deep in the woods was exactly what I needed. The idea was simple. Spend a week alone with nothing but nature around. No distractions. No people. No noise except for the wind in the trees and the occasional bird call. I imagined long, quiet days of reading, hiking, and just being still. It was supposed to be a break, a reset. The cabin I rented was small but sturdy, built by hand decades ago, sitting near the edge of a large forest. From the photos online, it looked perfect. Weathered wood walls, a stone chimney, a little porch with a view of the woods. The owner had assured me it had everything I would need. Electricity from a solar panel, running water from a well, and a wood stove for heat. The road to get there was long and rough, mostly gravel and dirt, and I was glad my old pickup truck had four-wheel drive. When I finally arrived, the late afternoon sun was just starting to dip behind the trees. casting long shadows. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. The silence was almost overwhelming compared to the city, but it felt good. I unloaded my bags, carrying firewood, food, and supplies inside. The cabin was cozy but sparse. A small kitchen with a sink and an old stove, a table, a chair, and a bed pushed into the corner. There was a single window looking out over the forest. I took a deep breath and let the quiet settle in. This was going to be my week away from everything. The first couple of days passed slowly but uneventfully. I woke early each morning to birdsong and the soft rustle of leaves. I made coffee over the stove, sat on the porch watching squirrels dart around the trees, and took long walks along the narrow dirt paths that wove through the forest. The woods were thick and green, the trees towering and close together. Occasionally, I would spot deer grazing in a clearing or hear the distant crack of a twig as a rabbit scurried away. I enjoyed the routine of it all, the simplicity, the peace. At night, I would light a fire in the stove and sit by it reading or writing in my notebook. The only sounds were the occasional hoot of an owl or the faint breeze rattling the leaves outside. I felt safe and calm. But then, on the third night, something changed. I woke just before midnight, a tight knot of unease twisting in my stomach. I wasn't sure why I was awake. The cabin was quiet. The fire had died down to glowing embers. Outside, the woods were dark, the moon hidden behind thick clouds. I lay still for a long time, listening. At first, I thought I heard nothing but silence. Then, faintly, a soft scratching sound near the cabin's outer wall, like something clawing or scraping. I froze, heart pounding. The sound stopped quickly, but my mind was racing. Was it an animal? A raccoon or a possum, maybe looking for food? I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Still, I couldn't get back to sleep. The next day, I decided to check around the cabin carefully. In the morning light, the forest looked completely harmless. I circled the cabin, looking for any sign of what had made the noise. The ground near the cabin was covered in dry leaves and pine needles. I spotted a few small scratches on the wood near the base of the wall. Not deep, but fresh enough to be noticed. No other tracks or marks around, though. I told myself it was probably just a wild animal and made a mental note to keep my food secured. That afternoon, I went for a longer hike. The forest stretched out endlessly, thick with trees and undergrowth. I followed a narrow trail that led deeper into the woods, past a small creek where the water was clear and cold. The sun filtered through the canopy, creating shifting patterns of light and shadow. The smell of wet moss and pine was strong. I found a spot by the creek to sit and rest. The quiet was soothing, but still there was that subtle feeling of being watched, like something was just beyond the trees, just out of sight. On my way back to the cabin, I noticed that the light was fading faster than I expected. The forest seemed to grow darker and more dense with every step. The shadows lengthened and the sounds of the forest at dusk grew louder. Birds flew overhead to their nests. Frogs began their chorus. By the time I got back, night had almost fully fallen. I ate a quick dinner. A canned soup warmed on the stove. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and shaking the branches. I tried to relax by the fire, but the uneasy feeling crept back. When I went to bed, I double-checked the locks on the doors and windows, then pulled the blankets over me. Again, I woke in the middle of the night, heart racing. This time, the sounds were clearer. Not just scratching, but something heavier. A low thud or series of thuds, coming from the side of the cabin. I sat up, listening intently. The sound stopped after a minute or two. I was too scared to get up and check. My mind ran wild with thoughts. What if it was a large animal? A bear or something worse? I remembered the emergency whistle I packed in my bag, just in case, and held it tightly. After a while, the silence returned. The next morning, I went outside early. The air was cold and fresh. I walked around the cabin slowly, scanning the ground. I found large footprints pressed into the soft dirt. The size was too big for any normal forest animal. I stared at them, heart sinking. What kind of creature had left these? I took a deep breath and tried to calm myself. It had to be a bear. I reminded myself I had no food left outside, and the cabin should be safe. That afternoon, I decided to hike out to the main road to see if I could get a signal on my phone and maybe call for help if I needed it. The forest was thick, and the trail was rough and uneven. The deeper I went, the quieter everything became, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. When I reached the road, I checked my phone. No signal. The nearest town was miles away. I stayed there for a while, looking back toward the cabin in the distance. The thought of being completely alone in the woods, with something big and unknown around, made my stomach twist. I turned back, walking quickly to get home before dark. As I approached the cabin, I noticed something new. A tree near the edge of the clearing had deep claw marks gouged into its bark. The marks looked fresh, raw, and angry. My heart pounded hard. I didn't know what to do. That night, I barely slept. Every noise startled me. The wind howled, branches scraped the roof, and the sense of being watched never left. On the fourth day, I started making a plan. I couldn't stay here alone if something dangerous was nearby. I packed my backpack with all the essentials: food, water, my knife, flashlight, matches, anything I might need if I had to leave quickly. I decided I would hike out at first light the next morning. That evening, as I sat by the fire, I heard the sounds again. Heavy thuds outside, just beyond the trees. Louder this time, closer. My skin crawled. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside into the cold night air. The beam cut through the darkness, scanning the forest edge. I saw nothing but trees and shadows. Suddenly, a low growl echoed from the dark woods. I froze. The growl came again, closer this time, filled with warning and anger. I backed slowly toward the cabin, heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. I locked the door behind me and bolted it tight. I stayed awake all night, listening to the sounds just outside. Heavy breathing, rustling leaves, snapping branches. When morning finally came, the sun rose slowly, painting the sky orange and pink. I didn't wait. I grabbed my pack and started down the trail toward the main road. The forest was still and quiet, but I kept looking over my shoulder. After a long, tense walk, I reached the road. This time, I had better luck with my phone. A weak signal, but enough to call for help. I explained my situation and asked for a ranger or someone to come get me. They told me help was on the way, but it would take some time. I waited by the road, feeling the weight of exhaustion and fear lift little by little as the sun climbed higher. Hours later, a pickup truck pulled up. A park ranger stepped out, listening carefully as I described the strange signs and sounds. He nodded, telling me I had done the right thing by leaving. We drove back together to the cabin. When we arrived, the ranger took one look around and furrowed his brow. "There have been reports of a large bear in this area," he said. "Seems like it's been hanging around your cabin. It's probably the one making those marks and sounds." He checked the claw marks and the footprints, confirming they matched a big male bear's. "We'll send a team to trap and relocate it," he promised. But until then, I wouldn't stay here alone. I felt a mix of relief and nervousness. I had survived the nights, but the reality of what was out there had been more terrifying than I could have imagined. I packed up the cabin quickly with the ranger's help and left the forest behind. As we drove away, I looked back one last time at the quiet cabin, now silent and empty. The woods looked peaceful again, but I knew the danger had been very real. I never thought I would be the kind of person who'd come here, alone, to this old cabin in the middle of nowhere. The kind of place where the only sound for miles is the wind moving through trees and the crackle of dead leaves under your boots. But here I was, standing in front of the cabin, feeling the rough wood beneath my fingertips and hearing the silence press down like a heavy blanket. The whole idea was simple enough at first. Get away from the city, escape the noise, the lights, the constant hum of people everywhere. I'd rented the cabin for a week, thinking it would be peaceful, a chance to reset, maybe write something, read some books I'd been putting off. I wasn't looking for trouble. I wasn't expecting any. But by the time the night had settled in and the wind had started to howl just right, I realized that this place was not as simple as it looked. The cabin sat at the edge of a dense forest, a place where no roads came close except a thin dirt track that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The porch sagged a little on one side, and the windows were covered with thick dust, but the door still shut tight. Inside, the air smelled of old wood and cold, like the cabin itself was holding its breath. The furniture was sparse: an old wooden table with some peeling paint, a couple of mismatched chairs, a bed frame with a mattress that looked like it had been used by generations of campers. Nothing fancy, nothing new. I unpacked my things slowly, the sound of my footsteps bouncing off the walls. Outside, the sky was darkening fast, the sun disappearing behind the tall trees. I had brought a small lantern, a few candles, and a flashlight with extra batteries. I wasn't stupid. I knew that once the sun went down, the woods here would be unforgiving. No streetlights, no neighbors, just miles of trees and silence. The first night was uneventful, if a little cold. I made a small fire in the fireplace, the logs catching with some effort and finally spitting flames that flickered against the dark walls. I sat close, watching the fire dance, feeling the heat on my face. Outside, the wind was picking up, making the branches scrape against the roof in a way that made my skin crawl. I told myself it was nothing, just the wind, the old cabin settling, maybe some animals moving through the forest. But the unease stayed with me. When I finally went to bed, the old mattress creaked under me. The walls seemed to close in as I lay there, the darkness thicker than anything I'd known before. I kept hearing noises, the snap of twigs, the rustle of leaves. Sometimes it was just outside the window. Sometimes it felt closer, like footsteps crunching through the dry underbrush. I tried to ignore it, telling myself I was tired, that the silence was playing tricks on my mind. But then, in the middle of the night, I woke up to a sound that didn't belong: soft, deliberate, like someone walking around outside, not just moving through the woods, but circling the cabin. I lay very still, my heart pounding loud enough to drown out everything else. The sound was faint, but steady. Step after careful step, slow and measured. It went around the cabin once, then stopped. I waited, breath held tight, but nothing else happened. The noise vanished. I didn't dare move. Morning came finally, weak and gray, and I told myself it had been nothing. Maybe an animal, maybe a neighbor checking on things. The dirt track was close enough that maybe someone had come by. But the feeling didn't go away. I kept hearing things in the days after: footsteps when no one should be there, the occasional soft tapping on the windows, the unsettling sense that I was being watched. I checked all the locks every day. The door was sturdy, the windows had rusty old locks. No one could get in without making noise. Still, every night the footsteps returned. Not always at the same time, but always slow and careful. I never saw anyone. No flash of a flashlight, no voice calling out. Just the sounds. Sometimes the wind was so strong that the noise blended with the rattling branches, but I could tell the difference. This was deliberate. This was someone or something watching me. The forest around the cabin was thick, old growth. The trees towered high, their roots tangled and thick. The dirt road was narrow and barely visible in some places, choked by fallen branches and weeds. I hadn't seen a car or a person in days. It felt like the world outside had disappeared. One afternoon, while I was chopping firewood near the edge of the clearing, I noticed something strange. A circle of flattened grass and leaves, like someone had been sitting or lying there. The ground was soft and moist, and I could see small footprints leading into the woods, away from the cabin. They were faint but definitely human. I felt a chill run down my back. I followed the tracks for a little while, careful not to step too loudly. They led into the trees and disappeared after about 50 yards, swallowed up by fallen leaves and thick roots. I didn't find much else, just the dark, tangled forest and the sound of distant birds. That night, the footsteps were louder, closer. Around midnight, I heard a sudden thump against the side of the cabin, like a heavy fist or a rock hitting the wood. Then another, and another. I grabbed the flashlight and swung the door open, shining the beam into the darkness. Nothing, no one. The dirt road was empty. The trees stood silent, unmoving, but the porch light caught something. A small stone on the wooden step, fresh dirt clinging to it. I stayed up the rest of the night, clutching the flashlight, listening to every noise. The footsteps stopped after that night, but the fear didn't. It was like the presence had changed. Instead of moving around, it was waiting, silent and patient. The next day, I decided to leave early. I packed quickly, pulling everything into my backpack. The forest felt heavier, the air thicker, like it was pressing against me. I locked the cabin door behind me and started down the road. But as I walked, I noticed something new: scratches on the trees lining the path. Deep, long marks like claws or knives had been dragged along the bark. They started a few feet from the cabin and continued along the trail for nearly a mile. My heart hammered. This wasn't random. Someone had been here, marking the trees, watching, waiting. The scratches ended where the dirt road met a gravel path leading to a small parking area. An old, rusted pickup truck sat there, empty and silent. I felt relief flood me. Someone else had been here. Maybe the footsteps, the noises, I wasn't imagining it. I ran to the truck and found the keys on the seat, along with a crumpled note. It was hard to read. The ink smudged, but it said one thing clearly: don't stay after dark. I didn't need to read anymore. I threw my pack in the back, jumped in the driver's seat, and started the engine. The sound of the truck was loud and rough, but it was the sound of safety. I drove away from the cabin, leaving the trees and the silence behind me. As the city lights grew closer, I looked in the rearview mirror once. The cabin was just a dark shape among the trees. I didn't look back again. I never thought a simple weekend in a cabin could turn into something so terrifying. The plan was straightforward: get away from the noise of the city, the endless buzz of traffic, the emails, the calls. I needed peace, silence, and a chance to clear my head. I had rented a small, old cabin deep in the woods. No electricity, no phone signal, just nature and the occasional hiker passing by. I'd never been to that part of the forest before, but the pictures looked peaceful, a little rustic but charming. The cabin itself was a small wooden structure built probably decades ago. Weather-beaten, with dark stains on the wood from rain and moss growing thick on the roof. It sat on a small clearing surrounded by tall pine trees, so close that the branches almost touched the roof. The path to the cabin was a narrow dirt road that twisted through the forest, and after the last half mile, the road turned into a barely noticeable trail. I had to park the car and carry my bags the rest of the way. When I arrived late Friday afternoon, the sun was low, casting long shadows between the trees. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, fresh and cool. I unlocked the cabin door. The key had been left under a rock, as the owner instructed, and stepped inside. The cabin smelled musty, like old wood and forgotten things. There was a small fireplace, a couple of chairs, a table, and a bed with a thin mattress. No electricity, no running water, just a small well outside and a wood stove for cooking. I unpacked my things, stacked some firewood, and started a fire in the fireplace. The flames crackled and filled the room with a warm orange glow. Outside, the wind rustled the leaves, and the occasional bird call broke the silence. I felt a strange calm wash over me, like I had stepped back into a slower time. For the first few hours, I enjoyed the quiet, reading an old book I had brought and sipping hot tea. But as the sun disappeared completely and the dark settled over the forest, things began to feel different. The forest outside the windows looked dense and impenetrable, black shadows folding in on themselves. The wind picked up and moaned through the trees, making the branches scrape against the cabin walls. The sound was eerie, like fingernails on wood. I tried to focus on the fire, the flickering light, and the warmth, but my mind kept wandering to the silence beyond the windows. I reminded myself that this was normal, the sounds of the forest at night, nothing more. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Around 10 p.m., I heard it, a soft rustling sound coming from the woods just outside the cabin. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but the noise wasn't random. It sounded deliberate, like someone moving slowly through the underbrush, careful to avoid snapping twigs, but still close enough to make the leaves whisper. My heart started to beat faster. I told myself it was probably a fox or a coyote, but the sound kept coming, circling the cabin. I went to the window and peered out. The firelight from inside reflected on the glass, making it hard to see. But through the darkness, I caught glimpses of movement. Something was there, just beyond the trees. I froze. The figure was too dark to make out, just a vague shape shifting behind the thick trunks. I backed away, my breath catching in my throat. I felt trapped inside the cabin with no way to call for help. My phone had no signal and the car was parked far away. The rustling stopped. The forest went silent again, except for the wind. I sat back down by the fire, trying to calm myself. The hours crawled by, and I kept listening, straining to hear any sound outside. At one point, I heard a loud snap of a branch nearby. I jumped, my nerves raw. The fire was dying down, and I had to add more wood. I grabbed an axe to split some logs, hoping the noise and light would keep anything away. As I worked, the wind blew harder, rattling the windows and making the cabin groan. The rustling started again, this time more persistent. I realized something was circling the cabin slowly, maybe pacing back and forth just beyond the clearing. I felt eyes on me, watching from the dark. I tried to ignore it and focus on keeping the fire alive. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I forced myself to lie down on the creaky bed. The cabin was cold in the night air, and I pulled the thin blanket over my head, willing myself to sleep. Sleep came in short bursts. Every time I dozed off, I woke to a noise. A branch snapping, a distant howl, the soft scrape of footsteps near the window. I tried to convince myself that it was all in my head. The forest was full of animals, and shadows could play tricks on the mind. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. In the early hours, just before dawn, I heard the loudest sound yet, a heavy thud against the cabin wall. It made me jump out of bed. My heart pounded so loudly I thought it would burst. I grabbed the axe again and slowly moved to the window. Outside, I could see the broken bark on the wooden wall where something had struck hard. Then I heard it low growling, a deep guttural sound that chilled me to the bone. It wasn't an animal I recognized. It was too close, too angry. Panic washed over me, and I ran to the door, unlocking it quietly and slipping outside. The air was freezing cold, and the forest was still dark, but the first hints of light started to show in the sky. I scanned the clearing with my eyes, holding the axe tight. The trees were silent, but I could see tracks in the dirt. Large footprints, heavier than a bear's, but more human in shape. They circled the cabin, disappearing into the woods. I realized I was not dealing with an animal. Someone had been out there, close enough to strike the cabin and scare me. My mind raced. Who? Why? What did they want? I decided not to stay another night. I packed as quickly as I could, carrying my belongings back to the car. The forest seemed even darker and more oppressive in the morning light, the shadows deeper than before. As I walked back along the trail, I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced I was being followed. When I finally reached the road and started the car, I locked the doors and breathed a sigh of relief. The trip that was meant to be peaceful had become one of the most frightening experiences of my life. I never learned exactly what had been circling the cabin or who had left those heavy footprints in the dirt. But one thing was clear: the woods were not as safe as they seemed. Even now, weeks later, I can't shake the memory of those growls and the feeling of unseen eyes watching me in the dark. I don't know what was out there that night, but I know I'm lucky to have gotten away. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. After a year full of stress at work and personal setbacks, I wanted to escape to a remote place where no one could find me, where I could unplug from everything and just be alone with my thoughts. A cabin in the woods seemed like the perfect way to do that. Nothing fancy, just a small, basic cabin deep in the forest, no cell service, no internet, no distractions. I needed that silence. I picked a cabin in a state park about 3 hours away from the city. The pictures online showed a tiny wooden structure tucked among tall pine trees. It had a porch, a wood stove, a small kitchen, and a sleeping loft. No TV, no Wi-Fi, just the essentials. I booked it for 5 days, planning to hike during the day, cook simple meals, and read by the stove at night. I packed my car carefully. Camping gear, enough food for the whole time, my sleeping bag, some books, and a first aid kit. I told a couple of close friends where I was going and promised to check in when I got there. The drive there was long but peaceful. The highway gave way to winding roads flanked by dense woods, the kind of forest where the sunlight filters down in patches through the thick canopy. I felt that familiar calm start to settle in as I got further from civilization. When I finally turned onto the gravel road that led to the cabin, my phone lost signal. I wasn't surprised. It was exactly what I wanted. The cabin was smaller than I expected, but cozy. The porch sagged a little under the weight of old leaves and pine needles. The door creaked as I opened it. Inside, the air smelled faintly of must and old wood. The furniture was sparse. A small table with 2 chairs, a metal-framed bed in the loft above, and a wood stove in the corner. The kitchen had an old sink, a tiny fridge, and a propane burner. There was a stack of firewood outside. I unpacked slowly, trying not to rush. After setting down my stuff, I went outside to gather some dry wood for a fire. The forest around the cabin was thick and still. The trees stood tall and close together, their needles making a soft carpet on the ground. I could hear birds and the occasional rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush. I stacked the wood carefully by the stove. That night, I lit a fire in the stove. The crackling flames filled the cabin with warmth and a comforting glow. Outside, the forest was dark and quiet. The moon was just a thin crescent, barely lighting the sky. I ate some canned soup, sat in a chair near the fire, and read a book until my eyes grew heavy. The silence was almost complete. No cars, no planes, no neighbors, just me and the forest. I fell asleep easily, wrapped in my sleeping bag in the loft above. The cabin was cold at night despite the fire, but the quiet was peaceful. I woke briefly once or twice, hearing the occasional snap of a branch or a distant animal call. Felt safe. The next day, I planned a hike. I had a map and compass, a backpack with water, snacks, and a first aid kit. The trail started just a few hundred yards from the cabin, winding through the forest and up a ridge that promised views over the valley. The air was fresh and cool, with the smell of pine and earth. I walked slowly, stopping often to take photos or just watch the wildlife. At one point, I came to a small creek. The water was clear and cold, rushing over smooth stones. I knelt to drink some and felt the cold water splash on my hands. Nearby, I noticed footprints, human and animal, in the mud by the bank. The human prints were worn, not fresh, but they made me realize that I wasn't as alone as I thought. I marked the spot on my map and continued. The hike was beautiful but tiring. The forest was dense, with tall trees that blocked much of the sunlight. The trail was narrow and uneven in places, with roots and rocks making footing tricky. At the top of the ridge, I stood looking out over the vast expanse of forest stretching to the horizon. It was breathtaking. I felt small but connected to something bigger. I got back to the cabin late in the afternoon, exhausted but happy. I cooked a simple meal of pasta and canned sauce, then settled by the fire again. The cabin felt welcoming now, almost like a friend. I read some more, then climbed up to the loft to sleep. That night was the first time I noticed something odd. Around midnight, I was woken by a faint noise outside. It was soft, like someone walking slowly, or a branch scraping against the cabin's side. My heart jumped. I froze, listening hard. The sound stopped after a few seconds. I told myself it was just the wind or an animal. The forest was full of noises I didn't recognize. I tried to go back to sleep but stayed awake for a while, eyes wide in the dark. The next day, I decided to explore a little more. I took a different trail that looped back toward the cabin but passed by a small clearing marked on the map as an old logging camp. The trail was narrower and less traveled. As I walked, I saw more signs that people had been there recently. Broken branches, trash caught in bushes, a torn piece of cloth snagged on a thorn. I felt uneasy but pushed on. When I reached the clearing, it was empty. but the remains of old machinery and rusted barrels told a story of years gone by. The silence was heavier here. I took a few photos and checked my watch. I had to head back before dark. On the way back, I noticed fresh footprints in the dirt near the trail. They looked too big to be mine, and they weren't animal prints. They headed toward the cabin. I stopped and stared at them, heart pounding. Whoever had been here was still close. Quickened my pace, half running now, glancing behind me. The forest felt different, colder. The wind picked up, rattling branches. I made it to the cabin just as the sun was setting, the shadows growing long and dark. That night, I barely slept. I kept the fire burning, the door locked tight. Every small noise outside made me jump. A twig snapping, a low rustle in the bushes, a distant howl. I kept telling myself it was just animals, that no one would bother me here. But the feeling of being watched was hard to shake. On the third day, I noticed something more troubling. When I went outside in the morning, I found my firewood pile disturbed. Some logs were scattered, and there were fresh footprints around it. The prints were definitely human, and they looked like they had come close to the cabin. I felt exposed, vulnerable. I thought about packing up and leaving early, but I also felt stubborn. I wanted to finish my trip. I didn't want to be scared away. I started to make small changes to protect myself. I rearranged the logs to make a kind of barricade by the door, set small traps around the perimeter using cans and string to make noise if disturbed, and kept a heavy metal poker near the bed in case I needed it. I also made sure to keep my phone fully charged in case I could get a signal somewhere to call for help. That afternoon, I stayed near the cabin, trying to relax, but my eyes kept darting to the woods. I heard more noises, footsteps, low murmurs carried faintly on the breeze, even though no one was visible. I saw shadows moving just beyond the treeline. I couldn't tell if it was animals or people. The fear settled deeper in my chest. By nightfall, the tension was unbearable. The fire barely kept the cold and darkness at bay. I was exhausted, but sleep was impossible. I kept listening for any sounds, the crunch of leaves, the crack of branches, anything that didn't belong. Around midnight, I heard something distinct, a deliberate knock on the cabin door. Not loud, just two soft raps. My heart nearly stopped. I didn't open. I sat frozen, clutching the poker, ears straining. The knocking came again, slower, then stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. I stayed awake until dawn, waiting for the first light to chase away the night. The fourth day was tense but uneventful. No signs of anyone nearby. I tried to keep busy, tidying up, collecting firewood, cooking. The forest seemed peaceful again, but I knew better. The sense of danger still lingered just beneath the surface. That evening, as I sat by the fire, I heard a sudden rustling in the bushes. I jumped up, shining my flashlight toward the noise. For a moment, I saw a figure. A man in dark clothes, face obscured by a hood, standing just beyond the edge of the trees. He didn't move or speak, just watched. Fear surged through me. I yelled and banged on the cabin walls, but the man vanished into the darkness. I realized then that I wasn't safe here. Not really. The forest was full of people, some who didn't want me here, who might hurt me. That night, I barely slept again. I packed up what I could, preparing to leave first thing in the morning. Before dawn, I loaded everything into my car and locked the cabin door behind me. I drove away without looking back, heart pounding, eyes scanning the road and woods. It was a long, tense drive home. My mind replayed everything. The footsteps, the knocks, the figure in the dark. I wondered who that man was, what he wanted. I never saw him again, but the memory stayed with me. Back in the city, I told a few people what happened, but many didn't believe me. They said it. I had always wanted to get away from everything for a while. The city was noisy, crowded, and filled with a constant buzz of stress. My job was draining, and I barely had time to breathe. So when I finally got a week off, I decided to rent a cabin in the woods. Not one of those fancy tourist spots with Wi-Fi and hot tubs, but a real old cabin, deep in the forest, miles from the nearest town. A place where no one could find me, where the only sounds were the trees and maybe some animals. I found the cabin online through a small local rental website. It was a small wooden place, built decades ago, on the edge of a pine forest that covered most of the area. The pictures looked perfect, rustic, quiet, isolated. The owner said it had basic electricity and running water, but no cell service. That was fine by me. I wanted to disconnect, clear my head. I packed the car with clothes, some food, water, a first aid kit, a flashlight, batteries, a map, a compass, and a book. I didn't bring much else because I wanted to keep it simple. The drive was long, about 4 hours from the city, but the closer I got to the cabin, the quieter everything became. The road turned from paved to gravel, then to a narrow dirt path surrounded by tall pines. When I arrived, the sun was already setting behind the trees. The sky was a mix of orange and pink, casting long shadows through the forest. The cabin sat on a small clearing, surrounded by thick woods on all sides. It was exactly like in the pictures. A simple wooden structure with a porch, 2 small windows, and a rusty metal roof. The door creaked when I opened it. Inside, the cabin smelled like old wood and damp earth. Dust covered the floor and furniture, but everything looked solid and usable. There was a small kitchen area with a wood stove, a table with 2 chairs, and a tiny bathroom with a sink and a toilet. The bedroom was a separate room with a bed and a small dresser. The bed looked old but clean. I dropped my bags, lit a lantern, and started unpacking. I spent the next hour settling in. I checked the wood stove, stacked some firewood, and made a simple dinner. Canned beans heated on the stove, a slice of bread, and some water. The silence inside the cabin was thick, almost heavy. I could hear the creaks of the old wood settling and the faint rustle of the wind outside. As night fell, I sat on the porch with my flashlight and the book. The stars were bright, clearer than I had ever seen them. No city lights to dull the sky, but the quiet also felt strange. Not peaceful exactly, more like the silence before something happens. I told myself it was just the unfamiliarity of being alone in the woods. Around 9 p.m., I went inside and locked the door. I checked the windows. They were all closed but didn't have locks, just simple latches. The cabin was old, and I wasn't sure how safe it really was. Still, I didn't feel worried. Maybe a little uneasy, but nothing serious. I got ready for bed, brushed my teeth in the cold bathroom, and crawled under the blankets. The bed was firm and creaked every time I moved. The only light was from the small lantern on the nightstand. Outside, the wind picked up, making the trees sway and branches tap against the roof. It sounded almost like someone was walking outside, but I told myself it was just the wind. I tried to sleep, but the unfamiliar sounds kept me awake. Every few minutes, I heard a sharp snap or a rustle outside. I kept telling myself it was just animals, maybe deer or raccoons moving through the brush. After what felt like hours, I finally drifted off. Suddenly, I woke up to a noise. It was a soft but clear knock at the door. My heart jumped in my chest. I sat up, frozen, staring at the door. The knock came again, slow, deliberate. I didn't move, just listened. After a moment, it stopped. I waited a long time, holding my breath. The silence returned, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, just beyond the trees. I debated whether to get up and look, but the thought of stepping outside in the dark, alone, terrified me. I turned on the flashlight and pointed it at the window, but I couldn't see anything beyond the thick shadows. Minutes passed. Then I heard it again, a soft scraping sound, like someone dragging a stick or clawing at the wooden siding of the cabin. My hands trembled. I grabbed my phone to call for help, but remembered there was no cell signal here. The scraping stopped, and I didn't hear anything else. I stayed awake the rest of the night, flashlight in hand, eyes wide open, listening to every sound. The forest outside was alive with noises I didn't recognize. Branches snapped, leaves rustled, twigs cracked, but nothing moved close enough to the cabin to be visible. By morning, the sun was shining through the windows. I felt exhausted but relieved. I didn't tell anyone about the noises. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe it was just animals. I told myself to be brave and enjoy the day. I spent the next day hiking nearby trails, taking pictures of the trees, the river, and the wildlife. The forest was beautiful and the air was fresh, but I noticed that every now and then I felt like I was being watched. Whenever I stopped and looked around, there was nothing but trees. Back at the cabin, I tried to relax. I cooked some eggs on the stove and read my book, but I kept hearing noises outside. Rustling, snapping branches, faint footsteps. The cabin's walls felt thinner, and I was sure the sounds were coming closer each time. That night, the knocking came again, louder this time, more insistent. I didn't open the door. Instead, I backed away and sat against the far wall. The knocking stopped, but then there was a loud thud against the cabin roof, like something heavy falling or hitting it. My breath caught. I thought about leaving, packing up and driving back to the city. But the car was parked far down the dirt road, and the last thing I wanted was to walk alone through the dark forest. The night passed slowly. No more knocking, but the scraping returned, now from all sides. It sounded like someone was moving around the cabin, circling it, trying to find a way in. I stayed as quiet as I could, clutching a heavy stick I found outside earlier. When morning came, I didn't sleep well. The sun felt weak, hidden behind clouds, and the forest looked darker than before. I decided to check the perimeter of the cabin. The dirt around it was soft from rain, and I noticed footprints, heavy, uneven, and large, circling the cabin twice. I followed the prints away from the cabin, through the trees. They didn't match any animal I knew. They looked human, but the size and depth of the prints suggested someone much heavier than me had been there recently. A cold fear settled in my stomach. Whoever was out here, they had been watching me, following me, maybe waiting for me to be alone. I went back to the cabin and locked everything down. I pulled the furniture in front of the door and windows. I tried to call someone on my phone again, no signal. No one knew where I was or when I would be back. I spent the next day barely leaving the cabin. I peered out the windows all day, watching the woods for any signs of movement. The forest was quiet now, almost too quiet. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. It felt like the woods themselves were holding their breath. That evening, I decided I needed to get out. I packed a bag with essentials, water, food, my phone, the flashlight, and the stick, and prepared to leave at first light. But during the night, I was woken again by a noise outside, this time at the back door. Slow, steady footsteps, stopping right there. I didn't dare look. I pretended to be asleep, heart pounding so loud I was sure whoever it was could hear it. The footsteps left, fading into the distance. I waited for hours, too scared to move or even breathe loudly. At dawn, I sneaked out quietly, grabbed the car keys from the kitchen table, and made a run for the car. The forest was still dense and thick, but I stuck to the dirt road, not looking back. When I got to the car, I found the back tire slashed. Someone had been there. Someone had tried to trap me. Panic set in, but I didn't want to stay. I grabbed the spare tire from the trunk and started changing it as fast as I could. My hands were shaking, sweat dripping down my face. Halfway through, I heard a twig snap behind me. I froze, slowly turned around, but saw nothing but trees. My flashlight was inside the cabin, and my phone still had no signal. I didn't dare call out or move quickly. Finally, I finished changing the tire and jumped into the car. I locked the doors and started the engine. The forest seemed to close in around me as I drove away down the dirt road, the morning light growing stronger with every mile. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, where I found a gas station and a phone signal. I called the police and reported what happened. They said they would send officers to check the cabin, but I never went back. I never wanted to. The fear wasn't about ghosts or monsters, but something far worse. The idea that someone had been lurking, watching me, ready to trap me in that empty... I had been looking forward to this trip for months. After a long, stressful year working in the city, dealing with constant deadlines and endless noise, I wanted nothing more than to escape somewhere quiet, somewhere isolated, somewhere peaceful. I found an old cabin for rent deep in the woods, a place with no cell service, no internet, and no neighbors for miles. The kind of place that made you feel like the world had stopped turning, at least for a while. I packed my car carefully, loading it with food, water, camping gear, and a few books. I told myself I would use this time to rest, read, and enjoy the simplicity of nature. The cabin was about a 4-hour drive from the city, tucked away on a dirt road that twisted and turned for miles. The last few miles of the road were rough, potholes, loose gravel, and narrow paths barely wide enough for my car. I drove slowly, eyes scanning the trees on either side, feeling a thrill of excitement mixed with a small hint of nervousness. The forest was dense and dark. Tall pines and oaks crowded the landscape, their branches stretching out like giant fingers. The air was thick with the smell of pine needles and wet earth. Every now and then, I caught glimpses of small animals darting through the underbrush. Squirrels, rabbits, and birds. The sun was starting to dip low in the sky, casting long shadows and painting the clouds in orange and purple. When I finally reached the cabin, I felt a strange mix of relief and unease. The cabin was old but solid, built from thick logs that had weathered many seasons. It sat in a small clearing surrounded by trees, with a little porch that creaked beneath my weight. The windows were dusty, but inside, the place smelled clean, like wood smoke and old blankets. There was a small wood stove in the corner, a worn dining table, a bed with a thick quilt, and shelves filled with books and old kitchenware. I unpacked quickly, stacking my food on the counter and setting up the stove. I lit a fire, watching the flames crackle and pop, sending warmth through the room. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, and the forest slowly settled into darkness. I felt peaceful, almost sleepy, ready to let go of the world. That first night, I slept soundly. The silence was complete except for the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustle of leaves. It was the kind of quiet you don't realize you've missed until you have it. I woke a few times, but the calm darkness always pulled me back to sleep. The next day, I spent exploring the woods. I followed a small trail that led away from the cabin, winding through thick brush and mossy rocks. The trail ended near a small creek where the water ran clear and cold over smooth stones. I sat by the creek for a long time, dipping my hands in the water and watching leaves float downstream. As the day wore on, I felt more and more disconnected from the outside world. No phone calls, no emails, no cars passing by. Just me and the forest. I gathered some firewood on my way back to the cabin, careful to take dry branches that would burn well. When I returned, the sky was beginning to darken again. That evening, I cooked a simple meal over the stove. Canned beans and rice warmed up with some spices. The cabin felt cozy, and the fire flickered against the walls, casting dancing shadows. I read for a while, then laid down early, hoping to get another good night's sleep. But that night, things changed. Around midnight, I woke suddenly to a strange noise. It was faint at first, almost like a whisper carried on the wind. I lay still, listening hard. There it was again, a soft crackling, like branches breaking, followed by a rustling sound that made my skin prickle. My heart started to race. The cabin felt different in the dark, smaller and less safe. I reached for the flashlight on the bedside table and clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, landing on the wooden walls and the small window next to the bed. Outside, the trees swayed in the wind, their shadows flickering. The noises continued, sometimes close, sometimes further away, like something was moving just beyond the edge of the clearing. I tried to tell myself it was probably just animals, maybe a deer or a raccoon rummaging through the brush. But the sounds didn't stop. They got closer. I sat up, holding the flashlight steady. Suddenly, something moved past the window, a dark shape, quick and low. My breath caught in my throat. I flicked the flashlight around, shining it through the glass, but there was nothing there. The shape had vanished. Fear started to take hold. I wasn't sure if it was a person or an animal. The woods around the cabin were supposed to be safe, but now I wasn't so sure. I thought about the stories I had heard about people breaking into cabins, or worse, getting lost and stranded. I felt exposed, vulnerable. The wind howled outside, and the noises didn't stop. Branches snapped just beyond the clearing, footsteps crunching on dry leaves. I tried to stay calm, telling myself I was safe inside, that the cabin door was locked tight. But then I heard its slow, deliberate footsteps on the porch. They were heavy, dragging, almost like someone didn't want to make a noise but couldn't help it. My heart hammered in my chest. I grabbed the small kitchen knife I kept for emergencies and moved quietly to the door. The steps stopped. I stood frozen, listening. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps moved away slowly, crunching through the leaves and into the woods. I waited another long while, barely breathing, before finally releasing the tension in my body. I locked the door again, double-checked the windows, and pulled the curtains closed. I sat in a corner near the fire, knife in hand, eyes darting to every shadow. The rest of the night passed without incident, but I didn't sleep a single minute. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the windows, warm and comforting. The cabin looked peaceful again, almost normal. I stepped outside to check the area around the cabin. The porch had no signs of footprints, but the ground was soft with last night's rain, so I expected prints if someone had been there. I searched carefully but found nothing. I told myself it had to have been an animal or my imagination playing tricks, but the feeling of being watched lingered. Over the next couple of days, I kept a low profile, rarely leaving the cabin and always keeping the doors locked. Every time I heard a noise, my heart jumped. The forest that had felt so welcoming now seemed menacing. I noticed signs of something strange. Branches snapped in odd places, small piles of rocks stacked unnaturally near the tree line, and sometimes strange markings on tree trunks that looked like scratches or symbols. I didn't understand what was happening, but I knew I wasn't alone. One afternoon, I went to gather firewood a little farther from the cabin. The forest was thick here, with tall trees and thick underbrush. I was careful, moving slowly, keeping my senses sharp. Suddenly, I noticed something odd on the ground. A small trap made from wire and sticks, just off the trail. It was crude but functional. It looked like someone was trying to catch something, or maybe set a trap for people. My stomach turned. I picked up the trap and examined it closely. There was no bait, but the wire was sharp enough to hurt someone or something. I realized I might be dealing with someone who didn't want visitors, someone who was watching me. I hurried back to the cabin, glancing nervously over my shoulder. That night, the sounds returned louder, closer. I heard footsteps circling the cabin, soft whispers carried on the wind, and the creaking of the porch swing moving all by itself. The fear was overwhelming. I didn't dare sleep again. I stayed by the fire with my knife and a baseball bat I found in the cabin. I thought about leaving, but the dirt road was far and winding, and night was falling fast. I felt trapped. In the early morning hours, just before dawn, I heard a scraping sound at the back door. Something or someone was trying to pry it open. I held my breath, heart pounding so loud it felt like it might burst. After a few tense minutes, the noise stopped. I waited another hour before daring to move. When the sun finally rose, I opened the door cautiously. The lock was scratched and partially broken. Someone had definitely been trying to get in. I packed quickly, loading everything back into my car. I kept the windows locked and doors secured as I drove away, never once looking back at the cabin. As I left, the forest swallowed the road behind me. The silence returned, but it was different now, heavy and thick, like a warning. I never went back. The experience stayed with me for a long time. I learned that sometimes the scariest things are not monsters or ghosts, but real people, hiding in the shadows, watching and waiting. The cabin was supposed to be a refuge, but it became a trap. Now, whenever I think about that trip, I remember the feeling of being alone but not really alone. The cold, sharp fear of knowing that someone was out there, close enough to touch, but hidden just beyond the trees. It was a reminder that nature can be beautiful and deadly, and sometimes the real danger is human. I'm grateful to have escaped, and I'm never going back to that cabin. I had always wanted to get away from the noise and stress of city life. The endless rush of people, the bright lights, and the constant hum of traffic had become too much. So, when the chance came to spend a week in a cabin deep in the woods, I jumped at it without much thought. It seemed like the perfect way to clear my head, breathe fresh air, and be alone with nature. I was craving peace, but what I got was something very different. The cabin was in a remote part of the state forest, not far from a tiny town most people hadn't even heard of. I had found it through a small rental website, the kind of place that looked charming in photos. A modest wooden structure, surrounded by tall pine trees and with a small creek running nearby. The website promised quiet, solitude, and no neighbors for miles. Just what I wanted. I packed light, bringing only the essentials. A few changes of clothes, my hiking boots, some canned food, a small camping stove, a flashlight, and a book to read. My phone barely had service there, which I welcomed. I told myself I'd use the time to disconnect from everything. No calls, no messages, no emails. The drive out to the cabin took longer than I expected. The last few miles were on a narrow dirt road that twisted between thick woods. The trees crowded the road so much that, in some places, the branches brushed the roof of my car. There was no streetlight, no other cars, no sign of life except birds and the occasional rustle of small animals in the bushes. When I finally pulled up, the sun was starting to set, painting the sky with soft oranges and purples. The cabin looked even smaller and lonelier than in the photos. It sat on a slight hill, its wooden walls darkened with age and weather. The porch was rough and creaky, with a single old rocking chair that looked like it hadn't been used in years. I felt a strange mix of excitement and unease. Inside, the cabin was sparse but clean. A small kitchen area with a sink, a wood stove, and a simple table. A narrow hallway led to a tiny bedroom with a bed covered in a plain quilt. The floorboards creaked under my feet, and the air smelled like pine and dust. There was no electricity except a few battery-operated lamps, and the water came from a well outside. I liked that, felt honest, real. That first night, I slept with the windows slightly open, letting the cool night air in. The sounds of the forest surrounded me. The distant hoot of an owl, the chirping of crickets, the rustling of leaves in the wind. I felt a deep peace I hadn't known in a long time. For a moment, I thought I had made the right choice. The next morning, I woke early, the weak sunlight filtering through the thin curtains. I made a simple breakfast of oatmeal and coffee heated on the stove. I planned to spend the day exploring the nearby trails. The map I brought showed a few marked paths that wound through the forest and alongside the creek. The woods were beautiful and quiet, filled with towering trees and thick underbrush. I walked for hours, breathing in the fresh, pine-scented air. Occasionally, I spotted a deer or a rabbit darting through the bushes. I kept my phone in my pocket but didn't check it. I wanted to be fully present. As the afternoon turned to evening, I headed back to the cabin. The sky was gray and overcast, the wind picking up. I noticed the creek had swelled with recent rain, its water rushing faster than before. Back at the cabin, I started a fire in the wood stove and cooked some canned chili. I settled into a chair near the fire, feeling warm and safe. That night, I had trouble sleeping. The wind howled through the trees like a wild animal. The cabin groaned and creaked as the old wood shifted. I thought I heard footsteps outside, soft and slow, but when I looked out, there was nothing. Just the dark forest pressing against the windows. The next day, things began to feel off. I went outside early to check the well and gather water. As I filled my bottles, I noticed broken branches scattered near the edge of the woods, as if something large had passed through recently. The ground was wet and muddy from the rain, but the tracks were deeper and wider than any deer or bear I knew of. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease and decided to hike a different trail, one that led farther from the cabin. The forest grew denser and darker as I moved deeper in. The canopy blocked most of the sunlight, making everything feel cooler and quieter. No birds, no insects, just silence. Then I heard it again, a low sound, like heavy breathing or slow footsteps, coming from behind the trees. I stopped and listened, heart pounding. The sound stopped too. I waited, but there was nothing except the occasional rustle of leaves. I turned back quickly, but the forest seemed different on the way back. The path was less clear, and the trees looked unfamiliar. I realized I had wandered off the trail. Panic started to rise in my chest. I tried to retrace my steps, but the woods were dense, and the light was fading. The wind picked up again, making the trees sway and groan. I called out softly, hoping for some response, but the forest swallowed my voice. After what felt like hours, I found the trail again near a large fallen tree. Relief washed over me, but the sun had set fully by then, and darkness crept in fast. I hurried back to the cabin, feeling more nervous with every step. When I reached the porch, my relief turned to shock. The door to the cabin was slightly ajar. I was sure I had locked it that morning. My stomach dropped as I pushed the door open carefully. Inside, everything looked the same except for a few things that were out of place. On the kitchen table, there was a small pile of twigs and leaves arranged neatly. The wood stove was cold. I felt a chill run down my spine. Someone had been here. I grabbed my flashlight and checked every corner. Nothing else seemed missing or disturbed. No signs of forced entry. Whoever had come didn't take anything. But why had they been inside my cabin? I locked the door again and went to bed with the flashlight beside me. I tried to tell myself it was probably an animal or a neighbor checking on the place, but I didn't believe it. The feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me. The next day, I packed quickly. I wanted to leave, but my car was blocked. Overnight, a large tree had fallen across the dirt road leading out. It was thick and heavy, impossible to move without tools I didn't have. I was stuck. I spent the day trying to find another way out on foot, but the forest stretched for miles, and I didn't want to get lost again. The cell phone still had no signal. I was completely isolated. That night, the sense of unease grew. The footsteps outside came again, slow and deliberate. I could hear twigs snapping in the dark. I stayed inside, windows closed and curtains drawn, but I knew I wasn't alone. Over the next 2 days, I saw signs that someone or something was near. Broken branches, footprints larger than any animal, and the same twig and leaf piles left on the porch and near the well. No one tried to communicate, just these strange messages. I didn't know what to do. I felt trapped and watched. I started keeping a fire burning in the stove all day and night, hoping the light and warmth would keep whatever was outside at bay. On the 5th day, I heard a sound I will never forget. A loud crash near the cabin, like a tree being thrown or something heavy hitting the wall. I grabbed a kitchen knife and stayed as quiet as possible. The morning revealed damage. One of the cabin windows was smashed, glass scattered across the floor. I felt completely exposed, vulnerable. Whoever or whatever was out there was not going away. I began to ration my food carefully. The fear was starting to wear me down. I felt desperate to escape but had no way out. On the 6th day, I made a plan. I gathered some wood and made a large signal fire outside, hoping a plane or someone might see the smoke. I stayed near it all day, watching the sky, waiting. At night, the footsteps came again, but this time, I was ready. I stood at the door with my knife and flashlight, waiting for whatever was out there. Nothing happened. The footsteps faded into the night. The next morning, I heard the distant sound of a truck engine. I ran to the road and saw a forest ranger vehicle approaching. I waved frantically. They stopped and asked what was wrong, but I couldn't really explain everything. They helped me clear the fallen tree from the road and drove me back to the town. I never went back to that cabin. The experience stayed with me long after I left. I realized how easy it is to feel completely alone and helpless in the wilderness. How quickly fear can take hold when you're cut off from the world and don't know what's watching you. I don't know who or what was near the cabin those days. Maybe someone homeless living in the woods, or a stranger passing through. Maybe it was a wild animal behaving strangely. Whatever it was, it wasn't friendly. That trip taught me to respect the wild and be prepared, to trust my instincts when something feels wrong, and to never take solitude for granted, because sometimes being alone is the scariest thing of all. I never planned to stay in that cabin for long. The idea came up last minute, something like a quick break from the usual noise of life. The cabin was supposed to be rustic, off the grid, deep in the woods where the nearest town was miles away. No cell signal, no internet, just me and the quiet. I told myself it would be peaceful, a chance to unplug, get back to nature, and reset my head. What I didn't realize was how quickly the peace could turn into something far from calm. The drive there was long, down-winding, barely paved roads that seemed to get narrower the further I went. I had maps printed out, old-school paper maps, since I knew the area was spotty for cell service. The GPS on my phone kept losing signal the deeper I got into the forested region. I wasn't bothered by that at first. In fact, it felt kind of thrilling. There was something about being away from everything, like stepping back in time. The cabin itself was nestled in a clearing surrounded by tall pine trees that blocked the sun in places. It looked like something out of a postcard. Wooden logs stacked with precision, a stone chimney rising up one side, a small porch with a couple of old rocking chairs. It didn't have electricity or running water, just a well and a small wood stove inside for heat. No phone, no TV. The perfect escape, I thought. When I first stepped inside, the air smelled like dry wood and something faintly musty. The cabin had been closed up for the winter, so dust coated the furniture and floorboards creaked under my boots. I opened the windows to let fresh air in, and sunlight poured through the trees, casting flickering shadows on the walls. I unpacked slowly, setting out a few things on the wooden table. A small camping stove, some canned food, a lantern, matches, and a couple of books. I had brought a thick sleeping bag and a pillow, and I made the bed in the single bedroom. The cabin was small but cozy, and I felt a strange kind of relief being so isolated. No emails, no calls, no distractions, just the quiet of the woods. That first night was cold. The temperature dropped quickly as the sun disappeared behind the trees, and I built a fire in the stove to keep warm. The crackling flames and the smell of burning would made the place feel alive in a way the city never did. I sat on the floor near the stove, reading by lantern light until I finally fell asleep, the soft sounds of the forest outside lulling me. At first, the days passed slowly but comfortably. I woke with the sun filtering through the curtains, made a simple breakfast, and went for walks in the surrounding woods. The forest was dense and silent, with pine needles blanketing the ground and moss growing thick on fallen logs. I kept to the paths marked on the map, careful not to wander too far. The air was fresh and cool, filled with the scent of earth and trees. Sometimes I spotted deer or squirrels, and once a fox crossed my path before disappearing into the underbrush. I liked those moments, reminders I wasn't entirely alone out there. But I also noticed how quickly the quiet could feel heavy. Without the usual background noise of cars or people, the forest's silence was complete, and even the smallest sound seemed amplified. A twig snapping underfoot echoed like a gunshot. The rustle of leaves sounded like whispers. After a few days, I started to feel restless. The novelty of solitude began to wear off, replaced by a creeping sense of unease. I told myself it was just my imagination, or maybe the isolation messing with my mind. Still, I kept checking the cabin door and windows every time I heard something unusual. One evening, just as the sun was setting, I was sitting outside on the porch, watching the last light fade through the trees. Suddenly, I noticed something odd. Fresh footprints in the dirt near the edge of the clearing. They looked like boot prints, large, heavy boots, but I couldn't see anyone. I scanned the tree line, but all I saw were shadows and branches swaying in the wind. My heart started beating faster. Whoever had been there hadn't left long ago. But why? The cabin was miles from the nearest road. There was no reason for anyone to be out here at this time. I grabbed my flashlight and carefully walked around the clearing, shining the beam into the woods. The forest swallowed the light quickly, and every direction looked the same, endless trunks and undergrowth. I called out softly, just in case someone was nearby, but only silence answered me. I returned to the porch and locked the door behind me, feeling exposed and vulnerable. I tried to brush it off as a hiker or someone passing through, but the thought wouldn't leave my mind. That night, sleep came hard. The wind picked up, rattling the windows and sending cold drafts through the cabin's cracks. I wrapped myself in my sleeping bag and stayed close to the stove. Every noise outside, a branch snapping, the howl of a distant animal, jolted me awake. I kept the lantern lit, even though the flickering shadows on the walls made the cabin feel smaller, tighter. I tried to focus on the steady rhythm of the fire, the warmth against my skin. But in the back of my mind, I knew something was off. The next day, I found more signs of someone or something nearby. There were more footprints, fresh and unmistakable, leading from the edge of the woods toward the cabin, then veering off again. I followed them carefully, tracing their path as far as I could before the forest swallowed them up. It was clear whoever had been here was moving around quietly, staying hidden but close. I felt watched, like eyes were tracking me from just beyond the trees. That sense of being hunted crept under my skin, growing with every step. I spent the rest of the day inside, boarding up the windows with spare wooden planks I found in the shed behind the cabin. The walls felt thin, and I didn't want anyone to see inside or try to get in. I kept my phone close, even though I knew there was no signal, and I charged my small portable battery just in case. As evening came again, the forest seemed darker, heavier. The shadows stretched long and twisted, and the silence was no longer peaceful but tense. I cooked a simple dinner over the camping stove, but my appetite was gone. When night fell, I kept the fire roaring and the lantern burning. I checked the windows every few minutes, listening for footsteps or voices. My ears strained for the slightest sound. The cabin felt like a trap, and I wondered how I'd missed the warning signs before coming here. Suddenly, around midnight, I heard it. A faint noise outside, near the back of the cabin. It was soft at first, like rustling leaves or someone moving through the brush. Then it got louder, deliberate footsteps crunching on dried twigs. My heart hammered in my chest. I grabbed the flashlight and a heavy metal poker from the fireplace. Slowly, I moved toward the back door, the floorboards creaking under my weight. The footsteps stopped. I shined the flashlight through the small window on the door. Nothing but darkness stared back. Then, a shadow moved just beyond the porch light's reach. My breath caught. I shone the beam again, more forcefully, trying to catch a glimpse of whoever was out there. But the shadow melted back into the trees. I locked the door quickly and backed away, hands trembling. I kept the poker close, ready to defend myself if needed. The rest of the night passed in a tense blur. Couldn't sleep, couldn't sit still. Every noise made me jump. The feeling of being hunted didn't leave. I wondered if I had made a mistake coming here. The next morning, I decided to leave. I packed quickly, gathering my things and extinguishing the fire. As I stepped outside, the sun was just rising, casting pale light through the trees. The forest looked calm again, but I knew that calm was just a mask. On the ground near the porch, I spotted something chilling. A small pile of stones arranged in a crude pattern. It wasn't natural, someone had placed them there. A silent message, maybe, or a warning. I didn't stop to think. I jumped in my car and started the long drive back to the city, checking the rearview mirror every few minutes. The forest stayed quiet behind me. I never went back to that cabin. I told myself I had been lucky to get out without more trouble. It wasn't ghosts or monsters that scared me, just the very real fear of someone lurking, watching, waiting in the woods. And sometimes, that kind of fear is the most terrifying of all. I never planned to end up in that cabin, not like it happened. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway, just me alone, to disconnect from the city and clear my head. I've been working nonstop for months, the kind of grind that seeps into your bones and makes you forget what daylight feels like. I needed silence, fresh air, something different than the never-ending hum of traffic and people. I found that cabin through an online rental listing. It looked perfect, secluded, in the middle of a thick forest, far from any town or road. The pictures showed an old wooden structure with a stone chimney, nestled beside a small lake, trees everywhere. I booked it on a whim, no one else coming with me. When I arrived, the air smelled like pine and wet earth, crisp and cold in the early evening. The sun was just dropping behind the trees, casting long shadows. The drive up had been narrow and winding, the kind of road where every turn feels like it might fall away. No cell phone signal at all once I got close, which was part of the appeal. I packed enough food, water, and gear for the weekend, including a small first aid kit, a flashlight with extra batteries, and a decent pocket knife. I didn't think I'd need much else. The cabin was exactly how it looked in the pictures. It sat on a small clearing near the lake, its wooden boards weathered and dark. There was a porch that wrapped around two sides, with a few wooden chairs covered in dust and cobwebs. I unlocked the door, pushed it open, and stepped inside. The smell of old wood mixed with dust hit me immediately, and the floorboards creaked under my boots. It was empty except for some old furniture, a rickety table, two chairs, a narrow bed in the corner, and a small wood stove. I started by unloading my bag, laying out my things on the table. I lit a fire in the stove with the dry wood stacked nearby. The flames gave off a soft warmth and a gentle glow that filled the room. Outside, the sky faded to deep blue, and stars began to twinkle between the branches. I felt calm, a little tired, but mostly at peace. I ate a simple dinner, a can of soup heated on the stove and cleaned up. Afterward, I sat on the porch in one of the chairs, wrapped in a wool blanket I brought. The air was cool but not cold, and the lake's surface shimmered under the moonlight. Everything felt still except for the occasional call of an owl or the rustling of small animals in the underbrush. It was the kind of quiet that presses in on you, the absence of noise so complete it feels unnatural at first. As night deepened, I went back inside and settled onto the bed. I had brought a thick sleeping bag and a couple of blankets. The bed was narrow and the mattress thin, but it was better than the hard floor. I was just about to drift off when I heard something outside. It was faint at first, a soft thud against the cabin's wooden walls. Then another. I sat up, heart quickening. Maybe a branch falling? Or an animal? I tried to ignore it, telling myself the woods were full of life and sounds like this were normal. I lay back down, but the noises didn't stop. In fact, they grew louder, closer. There was a scraping noise at the back door, then a heavy thump on the side wall near the porch. I grabbed my flashlight, careful not to make a loud sound. The beam cut through the darkness outside, but I couldn't see anything. Just the trees, swaying gently, their shadows long and dark. The thumping continued for a few minutes, uneven and heavy, like something big. I felt a cold knot of fear twist in my stomach. I wanted to convince myself it was an animal, maybe a bear or a deer, but the sounds didn't match. This was deliberate, repeated, and almost rhythmic. It didn't feel random. It felt like someone or something was out there, testing the cabin, checking if I was inside. My phone had no signal, so I couldn't call anyone. I flipped the dead phone over in my hand, the screen dark. I wasn't even sure if the batteries were alive, but I didn't dare turn it on and risk any noise. I sat very still, listening. The thumping finally stopped. For a while, nothing. Then came the footsteps, heavy, slow, crunching leaves and twigs. They circled the cabin, going around the porch slowly, back and forth. I held my breath, clutching the flashlight like a weapon. I wanted to run, to lock myself in a bathroom or closet, but the cabin was small and there was nowhere to hide that felt safe. After what felt like an hour, the footsteps moved away. The silence returned, deeper than before. I stayed awake the rest of the night, fire low, flashlight close. Every little noise made me jump. Every shadow seemed alive. Morning came cold and gray. I didn't sleep much, maybe a couple hours at most. I made coffee on a small camping stove I had brought and ate a granola bar. The light outside was weak, the sky cloudy and low. I stepped out onto the porch and looked around. No sign of anyone or anything unusual except for some disturbed leaves and broken twigs near the side of the cabin. Whatever had been there was gone now. The day passed slowly. I stayed mostly inside, poking at the fire and reading a book I had brought. I avoided going too far from the cabin. The woods around felt dense and shadowy even in daylight, the trees close together like a wall. The lake was still and quiet. I tried to shake off the fear, telling myself it was just some local animal or maybe another camper messing around. The isolation was playing tricks on me. At dusk, the noises returned. Not the same as before, but close. Branches snapping, soft footsteps, the occasional sharp crack like a stone thrown. I didn't go outside. I sat near the stove, flashlight ready. The feeling of being watched returned, heavy and uncomfortable. This time, I caught movement through the window, A figure, just a shadow really, moving between the trees at the edge of the clearing. I couldn't make out details, but it was unmistakably human-shaped. My heart pounded, and I realized the cabin wasn't as isolated as I thought. Someone else was here. I didn't dare step outside. The figure didn't come closer, just stayed at the edge of the clearing, watching. The night stretched on slowly. I barely slept again. The next morning, I decided I wasn't going to stay any longer. I packed quickly, throwing my things together, my hands trembling. I locked the cabin door, but the thought didn't calm me. I checked my phone again, still no signal. I started walking down the road, hoping to reach a place with signal or find a car. The forest was thick and quiet, every sound amplified in the stillness. After an hour of walking, my legs were sore and my throat dry. The road curved unpredictably, and I kept an eye out for anyone or anything. I heard voices in the distance, low and muffled. I moved toward them, relieved. But as I got closer, I saw it was a small group of men, about 4 or 5. They looked rough, dirty clothes and unshaven faces. Something about them didn't feel right. They noticed me immediately and stopped talking. Their eyes followed me as I approached. I explained I was lost, trying to find a road. They said I was near their land and offered to help me get back to the main highway. I wanted to trust them, but the feeling of unease came back strong. They kept looking around nervously, and one of them kept a hand near his waistband. Still, I didn't have much choice. I followed them on a narrow trail that led deeper into the woods. After a while, I realized they weren't leading me to the highway. The path was twisting and turning in the opposite direction. I started to feel trapped, panic rising. I tried to stay calm and look for a chance to slip away. The men talked quietly among themselves, watching me like I was some animal they'd cornered. My stomach churned. I knew I needed to get out, but the forest was thick and I had no map or compass. Suddenly, I spotted a fallen tree and broke off the path, sprinting through the underbrush. The men shouted behind me, their footsteps heavy and fast. My lungs burned as I pushed through branches and brambles. The woods seemed endless and dark. I ran until my legs gave out and I collapsed near a shallow creek. The water was cold, but I drank it anyway. I could hear the men getting closer. Desperation took over, and I scrambled to my feet, crawling under thick bushes and over rocks. Eventually, the forest opened up to a clearing with a dirt road. I didn't stop to think. I ran onto the road and saw a pickup truck parked at the edge, keys in the ignition. I jumped in, started the engine, and peeled away before the men could reach me. I didn't look back. I drove for hours until I finally reached a small town. I stopped at a gas station, called the police, and reported everything. The cabin was abandoned after that, and I never went back. The woods still haunt me sometimes, not because of ghosts or spirits, but because of how alone I felt, how real the danger was. I learned that isolation can be the worst kind of fear, especially when you're not truly alone. There are real threats in the world, and sometimes the scariest thing is knowing that someone else is out there, watching, waiting, and that you might not get away. But I did get away. That night, in that cabin, I survived. And that's what matters. I never thought a weekend in a cabin could turn into something so deeply unsettling. It was supposed to be a simple escape. Just me, the quiet forest, and a few days away from the noise of the city. I had rented an old cabin tucked deep in the woods, far from any towns or people. The listing had promised solitude and nature, exactly what I needed to clear my head. I never expected the place to feel so wrong. The drive up to the cabin was long and winding. The last few miles were on a gravel road that narrowed until trees crowded both sides so tightly the sunlight barely reached the ground. The forest was thick with tall pines and oaks, their trunks covered in moss and twisting vines. Birds sang high above, and the smell of damp earth filled the air. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, the sun was already low in the sky. The building looked older than the photos had shown. Weathered wood covered the exterior, and patches of peeling paint clung stubbornly to the walls. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, and the porch steps creaked under my weight. Despite the rough appearance, the place had a quiet charm. It was surrounded by wildflowers and ferns, and a small creek ran just a few feet away. Inside, the cabin was small but cozy. A stone fireplace dominated the main room, with a few worn armchairs and a wooden table scarred with years of use. The kitchen was tiny, with a stove that looked like it hadn't been used in months, and a sink with a faint smell of rust. A narrow staircase led to a loft with a single bed and a window that looked out over the forest. The air inside was cool and smelled faintly of wood smoke and pine. I unpacked my bags quickly, eager to settle in before dark. I had brought some canned food, water, a flashlight, and a small first aid kit. I wasn't planning on staying long, just a couple of nights to disconnect and relax. After setting everything down, I went outside to explore the immediate area. The forest around the cabin was dense but not threatening at first. I walked along the creek for a while, listening to the water gurgle over smooth stones. The trees rustled softly in the breeze, and the sky above was a fading blue streaked with pink and orange. I spotted a few squirrels darting among the branches and heard the distant call of a hawk. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I headed back to the cabin. The temperature dropped quickly, and the air grew thick with the smell of pine needles and damp earth. I lit a small fire in the fireplace and settled into one of the armchairs with a book. The cabin's single window framed the darkening woods outside, shadows creeping closer with every minute. Night fell fully, and the forest outside became a black wall dotted with the occasional glint of stars. I felt a peaceful solitude at first, the kind that only comes from being completely alone in nature. But as the hours passed, that peace started to shift. I kept hearing noises, small sounds at first, like twigs snapping or leaves rustling. I told myself it was just animals moving around, maybe a deer or a raccoon. The forest was alive with creatures after dark, and I was the outsider. Still, every sound made me glance up from my book, a little more alert each time. Around midnight, the noises changed. There were footsteps, slow, deliberate, and heavy, moving just outside the cabin. I froze. The fireplace's glow cast flickering shadows on the walls, but through the window, I could see nothing except the thick darkness. The footsteps stopped near the porch. I held my breath and waited. After a few minutes, the sounds vanished as quietly as they had come. I tried to calm myself. Maybe it was a deer walking on dry branches. Maybe it was nothing. But then, I noticed the front door. It was slightly ajar. I was sure I had locked it. A cold wave of fear rolled over me. I stood up slowly, trying not to make any noise. My heart pounded and my hands shook. I grabbed the flashlight and clicked it on, its beam cutting a narrow circle of light into the dark room. I approached the door carefully, peering outside. Nothing. The porch was empty. No sign of anyone, no footprints, no movement. I closed the door firmly and double-checked the lock. Then I moved to block the door with a heavy chair. My mind raced. Who could have opened the door? Why? Was someone watching me? Had someone followed me here? I didn't have phone service out here. No way to call for help. The cabin felt less like a refuge and more like a trap. I sat back down near the fireplace, my eyes scanning the dark window constantly. Sleep was impossible. Every creak of the wood, every whisper of wind made me jump. I thought about packing up and leaving immediately, but it was the middle of the night, and the road was long and unfamiliar in the dark. Hours passed like this. Exhausted but too afraid to close my eyes, I waited for the first light. When dawn finally broke, the forest looked less menacing. The sun filtered softly through the trees, casting long shadows and turning the leaves gold. I stepped outside cautiously to check the surroundings. The porch was undisturbed except for one thing: footprints in the soft earth leading away from the door. They were large, too large to be any animal I knew. Human footprints. Someone had been here close enough to touch the cabin. I followed the tracks for a short distance. They led into the thicker part of the woods and then disappeared near a fallen log. The earth looked undisturbed beyond that point. I spent the day on edge. I cleaned the cabin thoroughly, locked everything twice, and kept a baseball bat nearby. I didn't go far from the cabin, constantly watching the tree line. The forest that had seemed peaceful the day before now felt like a cage. That night, the sounds returned, footsteps circling the cabin, scraping noises on the wooden walls, something tapping lightly at the windows. Every noise was close, and I was certain I was not alone. I didn't sleep. I sat awake all night, eyes wide and heart pounding. The sun rose again, and with it, a strange calm returned. I knew I had to get out. Packing my bags quickly, I locked every door and window as best as I could. I took one last look around the cabin. Its battered wood and cracked windows seemed to watch me back. I felt the weight of being watched, followed, stalked. I drove away without looking back, the gravel crunching under my tires as I left the forest behind. Later, I learned the cabin had been used by hunters and poachers in the past. Local police reported occasional break-ins and strange trespassers, but no one had ever been caught. The experience left me shaken. The woods were beautiful and wild, but they hid secrets. I never went back to that cabin or any remote place alone again. Sometimes, I still feel the weight of eyes watching me in the dark. I carry a small knife now, and I never ignore the sound of footsteps. I never expected a simple weekend away at a cabin would turn into one of the scariest experiences of my life. I'm not someone who gets scared easily. I've been camping and hiking plenty of times, and I like the quiet of the woods. But this trip, something was different. I could feel it as soon as I arrived. The cabin was small, maybe 30 years old. It looked worn but sturdy, tucked in among tall pines and fir trees. The road to get there was rough, just a dirt path that twisted deep into the forest, far from the nearest town or highway. I had driven for nearly 2 hours on that narrow track, watching the trees close in around me until finally, I reached the clearing where the cabin sat. I had been looking forward to this alone time for weeks. The city life had worn me down with noise and stress. All I wanted was to get away, breathe fresh air, and forget about everything for a few days. The cabin was rented through a simple website, a basic place but with running water and electricity, so I thought it would be comfortable enough. No Wi-Fi, no cell service, that was part of the plan, to disconnect. When I first stepped inside, the air smelled old but not musty. The wooden floor creaked under my boots, and dust floated in the sunlight coming through the small windows. There was a wood stove in the corner, a simple kitchen area with a sink and counter, a small bathroom with a shower, and a bed pushed against one wall. The whole place was maybe 400 square feet. I unpacked my things slowly, setting down my backpack and lighting a few candles. I wanted to feel cozy despite the silence that wrapped around the cabin. Outside, the forest seemed peaceful at first. Birds chirped occasionally, and a soft breeze rustled the leaves. But as night approached, the woods became darker and heavier. The sun slipped behind the tall trees, and the shadows stretched long and thick. I made a fire outside near the cabin to keep warm and cook my dinner. A simple meal of canned soup heated over the flames. I sat on a rough log, watching the fire crackle, feeling the cold air on my face. The woods around me felt very quiet now. The normal night sounds, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of small animals, were missing or too faint. It was like everything was holding its breath. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the silence was part of being alone in the forest. After dinner, I went back inside and closed the door tightly. I didn't want to hear anything else outside. I sat in the dim candlelight reading an old paperback I had brought. The wind picked up outside, shaking the windows and making the trees sway. I could hear branches tapping lightly against the cabin walls. Later, I tried to go to sleep, but the old mattress was hard, and the cabin was colder than I expected. I wrapped myself tightly in my sleeping bag, but the noises outside kept me awake. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made me tense up. I told myself it was just animals moving around. Deer, maybe a fox or raccoon. Around midnight, I was woken by a loud noise outside. It sounded like a heavy thump, maybe against the cabin wall. My heart jumped. I froze for a moment, straining to hear more. Then came another noise, a low scratching, like claws or nails scraping wood. It was slow and deliberate. I couldn't see anything outside my small window. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds. I didn't want to open the door or even get up. I sat in the dark, listening to the sounds outside. The scratching went on for a few minutes, then stopped. I waited, waiting for something else, but the forest went silent again. I tried to convince myself it was a large animal, maybe a bear or a raccoon, but bears usually make loud noises when they come close, and raccoons aren't that big or strong. I was scared, but I told myself to stay calm. I checked that all the doors and windows were locked. I had brought a small camping knife and kept it by my bed. I didn't want to think about what could be out there. The forest was known for wildlife, but nothing should be this close or this persistent. The next day, I stayed inside the cabin most of the time. I didn't want to walk around the woods alone. I kept the fire going, cooked some simple meals, and read books. The sun was out, but the sky was gray and overcast. I noticed some broken branches near the cabin, as if something heavy had pushed through the undergrowth. I also saw deep scratches on one side of the cabin wall, long vertical gouges in the wood that looked fresh. I felt more on edge than ever. The scratches were too big to be from any normal animal I knew. Bears and deer didn't leave marks like that. The scratches looked like someone or something had tried to claw or pry the wood apart. I tried to call for help on my phone, but there was no signal. I was completely cut off. I had a small satellite messenger with me, but I hadn't activated it yet, thinking the trip was safe. That night, I barely slept. I kept the candles lit, and I sat with my knife on my lap, staring out the window into the darkness. The forest seemed to press closer, the trees like dark giants watching me. The wind was strong now, howling through the branches. Every few minutes, I heard noises outside, footsteps crunching on dead leaves, branches breaking, low grunts or growls that made my blood run cold. I didn't want to believe what was happening, but something was out there, watching, maybe trying to get inside. I thought about the stories I'd heard of wild animals attacking cabins, but those were rare, and usually the animals just moved on. This was different. In the early hours, the noises stopped. The forest was eerily quiet again. I tried to rest, but kept waking every few minutes, my heart pounding. On the third day, I knew I had to leave. I packed quickly, not bothering to clean or organize. I wanted to get as far away as possible. But when I opened the door, I froze. Large footprints covered the soft dirt around the cabin. The prints were huge, at least twice the size of a man's foot, and they circled the cabin closely, coming right up to the door. I had no idea what creature could leave footprints like that. Bears and wolves didn't have feet shaped like that. The prints had long toes and deep claws. I stared at them for a long time, my mind racing. I grabbed my backpack and started walking back to my car. The forest felt alive with eyes watching me. Every rustle in the bushes made me jump. I hurried down the trail, trying to keep calm. When I reached the car, I locked the doors and sat inside for a few minutes, catching my breath. I wanted to scream or cry, but I didn't. I started the engine and drove fast down the rough road, not stopping until I reached the main highway and cell service. Later, I reported what I saw to the local forest rangers. They told me they had no reports of missing persons or animals acting strangely in that area, but they promised to investigate the marks on the cabin. I never went back to that place. Even now, when I think about those scratches and the footprints, I get chills. Whatever it was something wild, something dangerous, and it had no fear of me. I learned a few things from that trip. Nature is beautiful but unpredictable. Being alone in the wild means respecting it and always being prepared for the unexpected. And sometimes, the scariest things aren't monsters or ghosts, but real animals or dangers you can't explain. That cabin trip changed how I see the forest forever. I still love the outdoors, but I'm never careless again. I make sure I know the area well, have a way to call for help, and trust my instincts when something feels wrong. Because sometimes, the forest hides things better than you expect, and it doesn't take much to find yourself face to face with something you never thought was real. I hadn't planned on this trip, at least not this way. The cabin was supposed to be a quiet place to clear my head, away from the city's noise, away from work and people. I needed a break from everything, but what I found was nothing like the peaceful retreat I'd imagined. What I found was fear. Pure, raw, slow-building fear that crept under my skin and stayed with me long after I left the woods behind. The drive there had been easy enough at first. I left late Friday afternoon, the sun hanging low and orange in the sky, casting long shadows over the highway. My plan was simple: get to the cabin before dark, settle in, then spend the next few days hiking the nearby trails, reading, and just being alone. The cabin was an old one, nothing fancy, owned by a family friend who let me use it while they were away. It sat deep in the woods, far enough from the nearest town that cell service was spotty at best, which was exactly what I wanted. I took the last turn off the paved road onto a gravel path that wound through thick pine trees. The air changed immediately, cooling and smelling of earth and pine needles. It was the kind of smell that reminded me of childhood summers, camping trips with my parents when I was younger. I hadn't expected to feel nostalgic, but there it was. I drove slowly, ears alert for any unusual sounds, although the forest was quiet except for the occasional rustling of branches in the wind. When I saw the cabin, I felt a brief moment of relief. It was a modest two-story wooden structure with a steep roof and a small porch. The windows were dark, the curtains pulled tight. The wood was weathered but sturdy, and smoke still curled from the stone chimney, proof someone had been there not too long ago. I parked my car on the small dirt driveway and grabbed my backpack, sliding the key from under the porch mat. The door opened with a creak. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood smoke and old pine. Dust lay thick on the furniture, but nothing seemed broken or out of place. The living room had a stone fireplace, a worn leather couch, and a small table with some old magazines stacked on it. The kitchen was basic: a small fridge, a stove, and cupboards filled with canned food and some stale bread. Upstairs, 2 bedrooms with simple beds and heavy blankets waited quietly. I dropped my bag on the floor and set about making the place feel a little more like mine. I lit a fire in the fireplace and unpacked a few things: a book, some food, a bottle of water, and my phone. Though I didn't expect to have much signal, the fire crackled, sending warm orange light flickering across the walls and ceiling. I sat in an armchair by the fire, letting the heat seep into my bones and the quiet fill my ears. As night fell outside, the forest grew darker and denser. The only light came from the fire and the pale moon filtering through the window. I could hear the occasional snap of a twig or the soft brush of leaves against the cabin's siding. Nothing that made me uneasy yet. I told myself I was safe here. I told myself the stories I'd heard about remote places weren't real, that danger only lived in movies and the news. The first night passed quietly. I slept fitfully, waking once or twice to strange sounds that I told myself were just animals. Squirrels, raccoons, maybe a deer or two. The next day, I explored the nearby trails, the forest alive with birdsong and sunlight breaking through the canopy. I saw deer tracks in the mud and patches of wildflowers along the path. The air smelled fresh, and the quiet felt like a balm to my stressed mind. But by the second night, things started to change. I noticed it first when I went outside to get some firewood just before dusk. As I stepped onto the porch, I saw marks in the dirt near the cabin. They were shallow but unmistakable footprints. They were too large for any small animal, and the shape was odd. Too long and narrow, like boots, but the pattern didn't match anything I recognized. I frowned and scanned the surrounding woods, but I saw nothing. No movement, no shadows, no glint of eyes. Inside, I double-checked the locks and windows. Everything was secure. I sat by the fire with my book, trying to shake off the unease growing in my chest. I kept hearing noises outside, scratches on the siding, soft thuds on the roof. Each time I checked, nothing was there. The forest was silent again, empty except for the occasional rustling of branches. That night, the sounds came closer. I woke suddenly to the noise of something heavy scraping against the cabin's back wall. My heart thudded so loudly I was sure it would wake me up. I lay still, eyes wide, listening. The scraping stopped. Then, slow footsteps circled around to the front porch, crunching over the gravel. I didn't dare move. I tried to control my breathing, slow it down. The footsteps paused just outside the front door. I thought about screaming, but my voice caught in my throat. The door remained closed. After a long minute, the footsteps moved away, fading into the woods. Sleep never returned that night. The next day, I searched the perimeter, looking for signs of who or what had been outside. I found more footprints. They were clearer now, pressed into soft mud near the back of the cabin. The shape was unmistakable, a boot sole with a distinctive zigzag tread pattern. I crouched and traced a finger over one print. The size suggested a man's boot. My stomach tightened. I looked around carefully, hoping to see something that could explain it. A lost hiker, maybe, but the forest looked empty and still. That afternoon, I locked all the doors and windows and sat with my phone in hand, hoping for a signal. Nothing. No bars. No service. I couldn't call for help even if I wanted to. The isolation started to weigh on me. Every sound outside made me jump. Every shadow seemed to shift just beyond the trees. The woods that had felt peaceful now seemed menacing, as if something was watching, waiting. That night, I kept the fire burning bright, piling logs onto it, trying to keep the dark at bay. The wind picked up, howling through the trees and rattling the cabin. Then the noises started again. Scratches and thuds, footsteps circling closer and closer, but always staying just out of sight. I thought about leaving, but the dirt road back to the highway was long, twisting through dense forest, and the sky was already thick with clouds. I didn't want to risk driving blind in the dark, especially with the strange footprints around. I told myself to stay calm, to wait until morning. But morning didn't come peacefully. I was jolted awake by the sound of the front door handle rattling, hard and fast. My heart leapt. I froze, unable to move. The rattling stopped, then started again, slower this time, like someone trying to decide if the door was locked. I grabbed the biggest fireplace poker I could find and crept to the window. Outside, under the dim light of the nearly full moon, I saw a figure standing just beyond the porch, tall, wearing a dark coat and a hood pulled low. I couldn't make out a face. The figure stood still, watching the cabin. After a few moments, it turned and vanished into the trees. I stayed at the window long after the figure disappeared, watching the forest swallow it whole. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I didn't leave the cabin. I kept the doors locked and the fire burning. Every noise, every rustle of leaves, made me flinch. That night, I didn't sleep at all. The forest seemed alive with sounds, closer than ever before. The scratching on the walls, the soft crunch of footsteps on the porch, and always the feeling of being watched. I started to think about what I could do if someone tried to break in. I checked all the windows and doors, moved heavy furniture in front of entrances, and kept the poker close by. My mind raced with worst-case scenarios, but I forced myself to stay calm. Panic would only make things worse. Then, just before dawn, the noises stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse than the sounds. The forest fell utterly quiet. No birdsong, no wind, no movement. It was as if the woods were holding their breath. I waited until the first light, then decided I had to get out. The moment I opened the door, the cold morning air hit me like a slap. The forest was still empty. I grabbed my bag, locked the cabin, and started walking toward the car. The trail back to the road was longer than I remembered. The trees seemed thicker, the path narrower. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see the figure again. By the time I reached the car, my hands were shaking. I fumbled with the keys, finally getting the door open and slamming inside. I locked the doors and started the engine. The headlights cut through the gloom as I drove away, the forest fading behind me. When I reached the paved highway and got a signal, I called a friend to come get me. I didn't want to be alone in that cabin again. Not after what I'd experienced. Looking back, I realized the whole thing wasn't about ghosts or myths. It was real people. Someone had been watching the cabin. Someone had been stalking me. But why? I never found out. The police checked the area later and found footprints. I never thought a simple weekend getaway to a cabin in the woods could turn into one of the scariest experiences of my life. I'd always liked being outdoors, camping or hiking, and a few times a year, I'd rent a cabin somewhere remote just to get away from the city noise and screens. This time, I picked a cabin deep in the forest of northern Vermont. The place was isolated, nothing but trees all around, no neighbors for miles, and an old gravel road that seemed to disappear into the trees. I arrived just before sunset on a Friday afternoon. The road in was rough, full of potholes and loose rocks, and I drove slowly to avoid any damage to my car. I had brought a few bags of groceries, camping gear, and a large box of firewood. The cabin was small, but sturdy, one story with a porch, a chimney for a wood stove, and a single room inside with a small kitchen area. The walls were pine, and the windows were old and thick, letting in only a dim light as the sun set behind the tall pines. The first thing I did was unpack everything and start a fire in the wood stove. It took some effort since the wood was damp, but eventually the fire caught and the room warmed up quickly. I ate a simple dinner, canned soup heated on the stove, bread, and some apples I'd brought. Outside, the wind rustled the trees and occasionally carried the sound of distant birds settling down for the night. The quiet was deep and thick, the kind of silence that feels almost heavy. As the night grew darker, I sat by the fire with a flashlight and a book, but my eyes kept drifting to the windows. The woods outside looked endless, pitch black except for the weak light from the moon filtering through the branches. Every now and then, I heard a snap or a rustle, maybe a deer or a raccoon moving around, but something about the way the sounds came and went felt off, like something was watching or waiting just beyond the edge of the firelight. I tried to brush it off as nerves and settled into my sleeping bag on the old couch. The cabin creaked as the wind blew, and the fire crackled low. I kept my phone close, though I didn't expect much signal out here. I had a small emergency radio too, but it was just a backup. Around midnight, I woke up suddenly. At first, I thought I'd heard my name called softly outside, but when I opened my eyes, the room was dark except for the red glow from the dying fire. The wind had picked up and was pushing harder against the cabin. I listened carefully but didn't hear anything except the usual sounds of the forest at night. Still, something didn't feel right. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it out the window, sweeping the beam through the trees. Nothing. I went back to bed, but sleep wouldn't come easily. I kept imagining shadows moving outside, shapes just beyond what I could see. Eventually, the fire went out and the room grew cold. I got up to add more wood, and as I did, I noticed the back door was slightly ajar. I was sure I'd closed it before going to bed. My heart pounded. I closed it tightly and checked the locks. Nothing looked disturbed. No signs anyone had been inside. I spent the rest of the night on edge, half listening for footsteps or whispers outside, but the forest was silent except for the wind. When dawn finally broke, I felt exhausted but relieved. I made coffee on the stove and ate some toast, trying to shake the unease. The next day, I decided to explore the area a little. There was a narrow trail a few hundred feet from the cabin that led to a small lake. The sun was shining, and the woods looked peaceful in the daylight. As I walked, I found broken branches and footprints, not animal but human. The prints were old but clearly from boots. It made me feel a little less alone, but also more nervous. Who else had been here? There were no signs of recent visitors, no trash or campsites. Back at the cabin, I checked the doors and windows carefully. Everything was still locked tight. I tried to call for help or even just to let someone know where I was, but the phone still had no signal. That was when I realized the remote nature of the place could be dangerous if something went wrong. I spent the afternoon reading and checking the perimeter of the cabin. I found some old rusted cans and a broken bicycle while hidden under some brush, signs that someone had lived or stayed nearby at some point. The feeling of being watched returned, a prickly sense that eyes were always on me just beyond the tree line. That night, I set up the fire again and stayed close to the stove, making sure the place was warm. I had no intention of sleeping near an open door or window. I locked everything tight and even placed a heavy chair against the back door. Around 11 p.m., I heard something outside. Not just the usual forest noises, but something heavier. Footsteps crunching on gravel, slow and deliberate. I froze. The sound came from the direction of the old gravel road. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it out the window, but the beam only hit trees and bushes. No one there. The footsteps stopped suddenly, and I thought maybe I'd imagined it. But then I heard a low rustling near the porch steps. I didn't want to open the door or look outside, so I stayed quiet, holding my breath. After a long moment, the sounds faded, and the forest fell silent again. I sat back down near the fire, heart pounding. I had brought a hunting knife for emergencies, and I kept it close. I thought about packing up and leaving at first light, but something made me stay. The third day was the hardest. The feeling of being watched didn't go away. I found more footprints near the cabin, fresh this time, as if someone had been circling the place. No prints led away, only around the cabin. I spent hours inside, checking every lock and window. I covered all the windows with blankets to block any view inside. Still, I could hear noises outside at odd times. Branches snapping, gravel shifting, heavy breathing maybe. I never saw anyone, but the signs were clear someone had been close. My food supplies were running low, and the cabin had no electricity. I couldn't stay much longer, but I was too scared to drive out in the dark on the rough gravel road, worried someone might be waiting. On the fourth morning, I decided I had to leave. I packed everything quickly, grabbed the last of the firewood and my gear. I took a deep breath and opened the back door. There, right on the porch, were fresh footprints, big boots, dirty and wet from the night dew. I felt a cold chill run down my spine, but forced myself to step outside. I looked around quickly but saw nothing. The woods were quiet, the sun just rising. I ran to the car, jumped in, and started the engine. I didn't want to look back. As I backed out slowly, I noticed a figure standing at the edge of the tree line, watching me. I couldn't make out a face, just a dark shape. I slammed the gas pedal, the car bouncing over rocks and potholes, my heart racing. Once on the main road, I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town. I went straight to the police station, reporting the strange footprints and the feeling someone had been stalking me. They took the report but said there were no recent crimes in the area. The remote cabins sometimes attracted hunters or squatters, they explained, but nothing serious. I never went back to that cabin or any place that remote again. The experience taught me to respect the wilderness, but also to be careful about who else might be out there, hidden in the trees, watching quietly. The fear I felt wasn't from ghosts or monsters. It was from real people, or at least the possibility of real people with unknown intentions. Sometimes the scariest thing isn't what you can't see, but what you know could be there, waiting. I still think about those footprints and the figure at the tree line. I wonder if they ever come back, or if someone else will find that cabin and the same chilling signs I saw. It's a memory I carry with me, a warning not to take isolation lightly and to always be aware of what's really out there. I'm not sure what compelled me to book that cabin. Maybe it was the need to escape the noise of the city, the constant hum of traffic, the endless notifications on my phone. I wanted silence, solitude, a place where I could hear myself think. So, when I stumbled upon the listing for a remote cabin nestled deep within the woods of northern Minnesota, it seemed perfect. The photos showed a modest wooden structure, aged but sturdy, surrounded by towering pines and a blanket of snow. The description promised peace, privacy, and a chance to disconnect. It was exactly what I was looking for. I packed light, just the essentials. A week's worth of clothes, some canned food, a few books, and my laptop. I told a couple of friends where I was going, just in case, and set off early one morning. The drive was long but uneventful. As I left the main roads behind, the landscape transformed. The trees grew denser, the snow deeper. My car's tires crunched over the unplowed path leading to the cabin, and I felt a thrill of anticipation. This was the isolation I craved. When I arrived, the cabin looked just like the pictures. It sat in a small clearing, its wooden exterior weathered but charming. Smoke curled from the chimney, indicating that the caretaker had lit a fire in preparation for my arrival. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The interior was cozy. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth warm and inviting. A small kitchen occupied the corner, with a table and 2 chairs nearby. A narrow staircase led to a lofted sleeping area. Large windows offered views of the surrounding forest, their panes slightly fogged from the warmth inside meeting the cold outside. I spent the first day settling in. I unpacked, organized my supplies, and explored the immediate area. The snow was pristine, untouched except for the path my car had made. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. That night, I sat by the fire, reading. The flickering flames cast dancing shadows on the walls, and I felt a deep sense of contentment. This was exactly what I needed. The next morning, I woke to a bright, clear day. Sunlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows on the snow. I decided to go for a walk to explore the woods a bit. I bundled up, grabbed a thermos of coffee, and set out. The forest was beautiful. The snow muffled my footsteps, and the air was crisp and clean. I wandered for a while, following no particular path, just enjoying the solitude. Eventually, I returned to the cabin, feeling refreshed. As I approached, I noticed something odd. There were footprints in the snow leading up to the cabin. They weren't mine. I had taken a different route into the woods. These prints came from the opposite direction and stopped at the front door. I felt a jolt of unease. Had someone been here while I was gone? I looked around but saw no one. The forest was still and silent. Inside, everything appeared untouched. My belongings were where I had left them, and nothing seemed out of place. I tried to shake off the feeling of discomfort, telling myself it was probably just a hiker or a hunter passing through. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind against the windows, set my nerves on edge. I kept imagining someone outside, watching, waiting. The next morning, I checked the snow around the cabin. The footprints were still there, but now there were more. They circled the cabin, leading to the windows and back to the door. Again, I saw no one, but the sense of being watched intensified. I considered leaving, but I told myself I was overreacting. I had come here for solitude, and now I was letting my imagination ruin it. I decided to stay, but I kept my phone charged and within reach. That evening, as darkness fell, I locked the doors and drew the curtains. I sat by the fire trying to read, but my eyes kept drifting to the windows. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there. Suddenly, I heard a noise, a soft thump against the wall. I froze, heart pounding. Another thump, this time at the back of the cabin. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously approached the window, pulling the curtain aside. The beam of light illuminated the snow-covered ground, but there was nothing there. No footprints, no movement, just the silent forest. I backed away, trying to calm my racing heart. Maybe it was an animal, I reasoned, a deer or a raccoon. I returned to my chair, but sleep was out of the question. The next day, I decided to check the perimeter of the cabin. I walked around, examining the snow for any signs of intrusion. The footprints from before were still visible, but there were no new ones. I ventured a bit further into the woods, scanning for any clues, but found nothing. As I turned to head back, I noticed something hanging from a tree branch, a small bundle wrapped in cloth. I approached cautiously and saw that it was a piece of fabric tied around a collection of twigs and feathers. It looked like some kind of charm or talisman. I didn't touch it. Instead, I took a photo with my phone and returned to the cabin. I spent the rest of the day researching, trying to find any information about local customs or folklore that might explain the object. I found references to protective charms used by indigenous tribes, but nothing conclusive. That night, the noises returned. Thumps, scratches, and what sounded like whispering. I stayed up, flashlight in hand, but saw nothing. The following morning, I made the decision to leave. I packed my things quickly and loaded them into the car. As I was about to start the engine, I noticed something on the windshield, a handprint smeared across the glass. I didn't wait to investigate further. I started the car and drove away, not looking back. I returned home, shaken but unharmed. I shared my experience with friends, but most dismissed it as an overactive imagination. Still, I couldn't forget the feeling of being watched, the footprints, the noises. A few weeks later, I received an email from the rental agency asking for feedback on my stay. I replied honestly, detailing the events and expressing my concerns. They responded with an apology and informed me that the cabin had been removed from their listings. They also mentioned that previous guests had reported similar experiences, though none as detailed as mine. I don't know what I encountered in those woods. Perhaps it was just isolation playing tricks on my mind. Or maybe there was something or someone out there. I haven't returned to the woods since. The city, with all its noise and chaos, feels safer now. At least here, I'm not alone. I wasn't planning on being alone that weekend. Originally, I was supposed to meet up with a couple of friends at this cabin deep in northern Minnesota. We rented it once a year, mostly just to get away from the noise of the city, fish a little, drink some beer, and disconnect. That year, something came up for both of them, and they bailed the day before we were supposed to drive up. I had the days off work already, and I didn't feel like wasting them, so I decided I'd go anyway. I thought a few days of quiet might be good for me. The drive up took about 6 hours. I stopped for gas in a small town before heading the final 30 miles into the woods. The road turned into gravel, then dirt, then narrowed down into something that barely passed for a path. The cabin sat at the edge of a small lake, with forests stretching out endlessly in every direction. We had been here 3 times before. It was rustic. No cell signal, no Wi-Fi, no neighbors. Just an old wooden structure about the size of a double-wide trailer. It had a porch that creaked, a wood-burning stove, 2 small bedrooms, and a generator that barely worked half the time. Everything we needed was there: canned food, firewood, propane, bottled water, and an old aluminum fishing boat that we never used. When I got there, I unloaded my gear. A cooler of food, my duffel bag, a sleeping bag, and a few basic tools. The cabin was musty inside, like it hadn't been aired out in months, which was probably true. I cracked the windows and started sweeping out the mouse droppings and dead bugs like we always did when we first arrived. The first night was peaceful. I made a fire in the stove, cooked up some pasta from a can, and played solitaire by the lantern light. I could hear the occasional howl of a coyote far off, maybe a loon from the lake, the wind through the trees. I slept light but not bad. It was cold, even with the fire, and I wrapped up tight in my sleeping bag. It was the second day when things started to feel off. I spent most of that morning outside. I tried fishing a bit, but the lake was still half frozen around the edges. So instead I went for a hike along the shoreline. I brought a small pack with water, a snack, and a flashlight. I knew the area pretty well, and I wasn't planning to go far, just enough to stretch my legs. About an hour in, I came across what looked like a crude lean-to built out of pine branches and logs. It looked old but not ancient. Maybe someone had built it last fall. It didn't look like much more than a place to keep dry during a storm. I didn't think too much of it, but I did take note of the fact that it was far off from any marked trail. We'd never seen any other campers or hunters out here, which was the whole point of coming. I kept going for another 30 minutes or so before turning back. On the way back, I saw something that hadn't been there earlier. A muddy boot print near the shore. Not mine. I was sure of that because mine had a Vibram sole, and this one was smooth in the center with thick ridges along the outside. A work boot, maybe. The tread was deeper too, which meant it had probably been made recently. I didn't hear or see anyone around, and it could have been from a hunter or trapper passing through, so I just filed it away in the back of my head. That night, I made chili from a pouch and boiled some tea water. I played more cards, then read from a paperback I'd brought. It got dark quickly, and the wind picked up. Around 10 p.m., I heard something that made me freeze mid-step on the wooden floor. It sounded like someone knocking, just 2 slow knocks, then silence. I stood there, not breathing. The wind had been strong, but this wasn't a branch or animal. It sounded deliberate. Dull thuds against the side of the cabin, low to the ground, like someone's fist hitting the bottom of the wood siding. I shut off the lantern. I waited. I listened for a voice, for footsteps, anything. But there was only the wind and the faint ticking of the stove settling. Eventually, I worked up the nerve to look outside. I opened the door slowly, flashlight in hand. I scanned the front yard and the trees beyond, but there was nothing. No prints, no sign of movement, just cold air and darkness. I stepped onto the porch, light shaking in my hand. I still saw nothing. I told myself it had to be an animal, a deer bumping into the siding, maybe the wind knocking something loose. I closed the door and latched it, tighter this time. I slept with the axe beside me. The next morning, I walked the perimeter. About 20 feet from the cabin, near the woodpile, I found something that didn't sit right with me. A cigarette, but a fresh one, still damp from dew. None of us smoked, and it hadn't been there yesterday. I started to feel watched. The whole day, I couldn't shake that sensation. That tingle at the back of your neck when you just know someone is looking at you. I spent most of the daylight hours stacking firewood and checking the generator. I left the flashlight and axe within reach the whole time. I didn't hear anything unusual that day, but I didn't like how silent it was either. That night, I didn't even bother with games or reading. I sat by the window watching. I left the lantern off, trying to let my eyes adjust to the moonlight so I could see better outside. Around midnight, I saw movement at the edge of the treeline, just a shadow stepping between the trees. It wasn't an animal. It was too tall, too smooth in its stride. I grabbed the axe and crouched low behind the couch, peeking over the windowsill. It didn't come closer. It just stood there. Then it moved off to the right and disappeared behind the trees again. I waited for what felt like hours before I finally fell asleep from sheer exhaustion, axe in hand. The next day, I was done pretending. I packed up my bag and cooler, checked the tires on my truck, and got ready to leave. But when I turned the key in the ignition, nothing happened. The engine clicked, but it wouldn't turn over. I tried again. Same result. The battery was dead. I popped the hood. Everything looked fine. No wires were obviously cut or frayed. But I'm not a mechanic. I only know the basics. Still, it had started fine just 3 days ago. I had to assume it was tampered with. I locked myself inside the cabin and spent that whole day on edge. I ate cold food. I didn't light a fire. I didn't want to draw attention. I tried the generator, but it wouldn't start either. I started to realize just how isolated I really was. No cell signal, no neighbors, no way to call for help. That night, it was worse. Around 1 a.m., I heard footsteps. On the porch, slow, heavy steps, someone pacing back and forth, just outside the door. I sat frozen on the floor, axe in hand, heart hammering. The footsteps paused. Then I heard the doorknob rattle. Then silence. They didn't knock. They didn't speak. They just tried the handle once, then walked away. I waited till sunrise before I moved. I didn't sleep. I didn't even blink much. As soon as it was light out, I took my pack and started walking. I didn't even care which direction. I figured I'd follow the road back toward the last town I passed, even if it took all day. I just wanted out of there. About 2 miles down the dirt road, I found something that made me stop cold. Tire tracks, not mine, fresh ones, and boot prints beside them, the same tread pattern as the ones near the cabin. They circled off into the woods. Someone had been parked just off the path, hiding their vehicle. I picked up the pace, constantly looking over my shoulder. Every sound made me jump. A snapping twig, a bird flying overhead, a branch scraping against another. I didn't stop until I saw power lines, then a mailbox. Eventually, I made it to a gas station. The guy behind the counter gave me a funny look when I walked in, covered in sweat and dirt, carrying an axe. I explained what happened briefly without sounding crazy. He let me use the phone to call for a tow truck. They got my truck running again later that day, though they couldn't tell what had drained the battery. I never went back to that cabin. I told my friends it was the weather, the cold, the generator. I didn't tell them about the cigarette or the knocking or the figure in the woods. A month later, I found a post on a local hunting forum. A guy mentioned finding an abandoned lean-to near the same lake. He said it looked like someone had been living out there for a while. Lots of cigarette butts, food wrappers, even some tools. No one knew who it belonged to. It wasn't a ranger station or survivalist camp. Just someone's hiding place. I think about that night sometimes. The footsteps, the knocking, the cigarette. Someone was watching me, maybe waiting for me to leave the cabin, or maybe hoping I wouldn't. I'm lucky I left when I did. That cabin's still up there, probably. Still cold, still quiet, but I won't ever go back. Some places don't need ghosts to be scary. Some places are scary enough just because of the people who find them. City life had been wearing me down for years. I'd wake up every morning to sirens, car horns, people yelling outside my apartment window. My phone never stopped buzzing, and the pressure at work kept climbing. I had started drinking too much, sleeping too little, and the idea of going anywhere quiet started sounding more like survival than vacation. I knew I needed to get away, somewhere far, somewhere with no noise, no people, and no phone signal. So when I found an old listing online for a remote cabin up north in the Miller's Ridge area, I jumped on it without hesitation. It was a small, privately owned wooden cabin sitting on 5 acres of forested land. No neighbors for miles. The owner had posted a few photos. It looked aged, but it had a roof, a bed, and 4 walls. That was enough for me. I packed lightly, a backpack with some basic clothes, a few cans of food, a flashlight, knife, water purifier, fire starter, and a good sleeping bag. I had to drive about 5 hours north from the city, and the last 30 miles were nothing but gravel and dirt roads, cutting through thick woods that didn't seem to end. My GPS quit working halfway up the ridge, so I followed the written directions the cabin owner had emailed me. By the time I got to the clearing, it was early evening. The sun was just starting to drop behind the trees, and everything was golden and quiet. I parked next to a tree stump and looked at the cabin. It was small, built from logs with a low roof and a stone chimney. The door creaked when I pushed it open, and dust floated in the air like smoke. The inside smelled like wood and old fabric. There was one room with a wood stove, a table, a few shelves, and a mattress on a wooden frame in the corner. No electricity, no plumbing, just silence. I liked it right away. The first night was peaceful. I lit a fire in the stove using some chopped wood stacked behind the cabin and ate a can of chili by candlelight. I could hear the wind moving through the trees, owls calling in the distance. I slept hard that night, wrapped up in my sleeping bag with the fire crackling. The second day, I hiked around the property. The trees were dense, mostly pines and spruce, and the ground was thick with fallen needles and moss. I found a small stream a few hundred feet downhill and used it to refill my bottles. There were animal tracks, deer mostly, but also a few larger ones I didn't recognize. I wasn't too worried. I had bear spray and a decent knife, though I doubted I'd need either. By the 4th day, I had fully adjusted. I stopped checking my phone. I stopped thinking about work. My mind felt clean, like someone had poured cool water into it and washed out the noise. I chopped wood, read old paperbacks, and sat by the fire at night. It felt good to be disconnected. But things started to shift around the 6th day. It began small. I noticed a few pieces of firewood moved from where I'd stacked them behind the cabin. Not missing, just shifted slightly. I figured an animal had brushed against them. Then I found small twigs arranged in a triangle near the side of the cabin. I thought maybe they'd fallen like that, but it was oddly clean and deliberate looking. I kicked them aside and forgot about it. That night, I heard something outside. It was late, maybe 1 or 2 a.m., and the fire had burned low. I was lying awake, staring at the ceiling beams, when I heard the sound, soft crunching footsteps on the pine needles just beyond the cabin. Slow, deliberate. One step, then another, then a pause. My first thought was that it was a deer, maybe a moose, but it didn't sound like an animal. The pattern was too even, too careful. I sat up slowly and listened harder. The steps moved around the cabin, circling it once before fading off toward the trees. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I walked around the cabin looking for prints. The ground was soft in places and I found one, a partial boot tread, faint but definitely human. It wasn't mine. I had size 11s with thick rubber soles. This was smaller, with a flat sole and a different pattern. I stared at it for a long time, trying to convince myself maybe it was old. Maybe it had been there since before I arrived. But the pine needles around it looked fresh, like they'd just been disturbed. I told myself someone might have wandered through, maybe a hunter, but Miller's Ridge was private land. I hadn't seen a single person in 6 days. I hadn't heard a car or a plane or even a dog bark. Whoever had been out there, if they were out there, hadn't just stumbled by accident. That night, I didn't light the fire. I kept everything dark and sat in the corner near the window with my flashlight and knife. The moon was out, throwing pale light across the clearing. Around midnight, I saw movement. A figure walking slowly between the trees on the edge of the clearing. Not running, not sneaking, just walking, upright, human. They stopped near the far tree line and stood there, not moving, just watching the cabin. I couldn't make out any details, just a silhouette, but I stayed completely still. I didn't want to shine my flashlight. I didn't want them to know I had seen them. They stood there for what felt like 10 minutes, then turned and disappeared into the woods. I didn't sleep again that night. By morning, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. I packed everything back into my backpack, double-checked the cabin to make sure I hadn't left anything behind, and locked the door, even though I knew it wouldn't keep anyone out. When I got to my car, I found something that stopped me cold. The air had gone still, completely still. Not a single branch moved. And sitting on the hood of my car, placed neatly in the center, was a dead squirrel with its neck broken and its body folded in half. Not eaten, not chewed, just broken and placed there. I stood staring at it for a long time. I didn't touch it. I didn't say anything. I just opened the car door, got in, and locked it. I drove back down the trail as fast as I could without damaging the tires. About a mile down the ridge, I saw something in the rearview mirror. A person, walking down the center of the trail behind me, slowly shrinking in the mirror as I drove away. When I finally reached the main road, I kept going. I didn't stop for gas until I hit a larger town almost 2 hours away. My hands shook the whole time I filled the tank. I didn't sleep well for weeks after that. I reported what I saw to the county sheriff's office, but I could tell they didn't take it seriously. They said the ridge was private land and warned me it wasn't unusual to run into strange people in the woods. People hiding out, off-grid types. They took my statement but said unless I had a name or proof of trespassing or a crime, there wasn't much they could do. I never went back to that cabin. I don't even know if the listing is still active. The owner stopped responding to my emails after I asked about the property. I thought about leaving a review or posting about it, but I didn't want to start something I couldn't finish. Looking back, I don't think it was just someone passing through. I think someone had been living near that cabin, watching it, waiting for people like me to come stay. Maybe they didn't want company. Maybe they just wanted to scare me. But the way they moved, the way they left things, it felt practiced. Like it wasn't the first time. That cabin gave me what I thought I wanted. Silence, distance, isolation. But I learned something important up there. Out in the woods, where no one can hear you, silence isn't peace. Silence is the sound of something waiting, and I'll never forget that. I had been feeling burned out from work for a long time. I work in IT, mostly remote, and spend most of my days staring at screens, handling support tickets, and dealing with people who barely know how to turn on a computer. It gets old fast. After months of 60-hour weeks, I finally convinced myself to take some time off. I didn't want a fancy resort or anything loud. I just wanted quiet, somewhere isolated. A cabin in the woods seemed perfect. I found one on a rental site. It was located in northern Minnesota, about 4 hours from where I live. The listing said it was by a small lake and backed up against a state forest. It looked perfect in the photos. 1 bedroom, with stove, dock on the lake, no Wi-Fi, and just enough cell service to call for help if needed. I booked it for 10 days. The drive up was mostly uneventful. I stopped for gas, picked up some groceries, and followed a winding gravel road for nearly an hour before reaching the property. The trees were thick, and the last half mile felt like I was driving into the middle of nowhere. When I finally reached the cabin, it looked just like the pictures. Maybe even better. It was solid, made of thick logs, with a small front porch and a fire pit off to the side. The lake was just a few steps downhill, still and quiet, surrounded by trees. No boats, no houses, no noise. The first few days were peaceful. I woke up late, cooked big breakfasts, and spent hours sitting on the porch or down by the lake reading. I went on hikes through the woods, not straying too far, just following some game trails and old logging paths. I didn't see anyone. No other cabins, no hikers, nothing. Just animals and silence. That was the best part. By the fourth day, I started to feel truly relaxed. I stopped checking my phone. I forgot about emails. I spent the entire afternoon fishing off the dock, even though I didn't catch anything. That night, I lit a fire and sat by it until well after midnight, watching the flames crackle and listening to owls. But something changed on the fifth morning. I woke up feeling uneasy. There wasn't any clear reason why. I chalked it up to a strange dream or maybe eating too much the night before. The woods felt quieter than usual, though. I couldn't hear the birds like I had every other morning. Just silence. Stuck with me. I went for another walk that afternoon, hoping to shake it off. I followed one of the same trails I had used before, maybe a mile out, and stopped at a spot where the trees opened up a little and gave a nice view of the lake from the hill. I sat on a rock for a while, just trying to enjoy the view, but I kept feeling like I was being watched. I kept looking over my shoulder. There was no one there, but the feeling wouldn't leave. On my way back, I noticed something odd. There were footprints on the trail that hadn't been there before. Human prints. They looked fairly fresh. I paused and studied them. They weren't mine. I had on hiking boots. These looked like they came from worn-down sneakers. No deep tread. I felt a weird tightness in my chest. Maybe someone else was camping nearby? Maybe someone passed through? Still, it felt wrong. I hadn't seen anyone for days. No cars on the road. No campsites in the area that I knew of. The prints followed the same trail I had taken and veered off deeper into the woods. I stood there for a while, debating whether to follow them. In the end, I kept walking toward the cabin. Back at the cabin, I tried to brush it off. I made dinner, cleaned up, and read until it got dark. But the unease didn't go away. That night, I had trouble sleeping. I kept waking up, convinced I had heard something outside. Branches snapping, leaves rustling. Every time I looked through the window, there was nothing. On the sixth morning, I noticed something disturbing. Near the side of the cabin, where the trees came close, I saw signs of someone standing there. The ground was disturbed, leaves pushed aside, small patches of bare dirt where someone had shifted their weight. I walked over, crouched, and looked closely. Shoe prints, same kind as before. Whoever it was had been standing right by the corner of the cabin, where they could see both the front door and the path leading to the dock. I felt a deep chill run through me. I walked the whole property after that, circling the cabin, checking the tree line, looking for anything else. I didn't find anything more, but that didn't help me feel better. That afternoon, I debated leaving. I even packed some of my stuff and put it in the trunk. But I kept thinking maybe I was overreacting. Maybe it had been some hiker who took a wrong turn. Maybe they were already gone. I stayed one more night, though I barely slept. That seventh day was when things escalated. I woke up and saw something hanging from the porch railing. A dead rabbit, tied by its back legs with twine. Its body was bloody, throat slit. It wasn't there the night before. I stood there staring at it for a long time. My stomach turned, and I felt sick. This wasn't some random animal kill. Someone had done this and left it for me to find. I didn't even bother packing the rest of my stuff. I grabbed my backpack, got in my car, and drove. I didn't stop until I reached a town with a gas station and people. I called the county sheriff and told them everything. They sent someone out to meet me. I gave them the address and told them what I saw. The deputy I spoke to seemed concerned but not surprised. He said the area had some problems with squatters and survivalists who lived off-grid. Some of them didn't like outsiders. Said they might try to scare people off, but it usually didn't go beyond that. Still, he agreed to send someone to check the cabin. I got a call 2 days later. The deputy said they found signs of someone camping out a few hundred yards into the forest behind the cabin. A tarp, some empty cans, footprints matching what I saw. But no one was there when they arrived. Whoever it was had vanished. I never went back to the cabin. I contacted the rental owner and told them what happened. They offered me a partial refund, said they'd check it out. I don't know if they ever did. After that trip, I started locking everything more often. I put cameras around my house. I started carrying pepper spray when I go hiking. That feeling of being watched has never completely gone away, but I'm grateful I left when I did. I don't want to think about what might have happened if I stayed one more night. Some people go off the grid for peace. Others go out there to hide from something. The woods are big enough to hold both. I still love being outdoors, but now I always pay attention to the little things. A broken branch, a footprint, a missing sound. You can tell when something's off if you listen close enough. That trip taught me how to listen. It started when I decided to take a break from everything for a while. Work had been eating me alive for the past year, and I was getting burnt out. I had just turned 35, living alone, barely seeing anyone outside my job. And even then, it was just meetings, deadlines, and more work. I needed to shut it all off. So I planned a trip out to a cabin I found online. It was deep in the woods of northern Michigan, off a long dirt road that wasn't on most maps, and miles away from the nearest town. No Wi-Fi, no neighbors, no phone signal. That was the point. I packed enough supplies for a week. Food, water, a generator, gas, a sleeping bag, some books, and a few basic tools. The cabin was one of those places owned by someone who rented it out occasionally but didn't seem to care much about it. There were a few pictures online and a short, vague description. It was cheap, and I didn't ask many questions. The drive up was long. I left early in the morning and made it there just before dark. The last few miles were rough. Narrow dirt roads, potholes, and overgrown trees scraping against my truck. I started to wonder if I was crazy for doing this, but I had already committed. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, it looked even older and more worn down than I expected. The wooden steps leading up to the front porch were warped. The railing leaned to one side, and the paint on the door was chipped and peeling. But it was standing. That was enough. Inside, it was simple. One room with a small kitchen area, a table, an old couch, and a cot in the corner. A wood stove sat near the far wall. There was a bathroom in the back with a compost toilet and a gravity-fed water tank. I set my stuff down and got to work. I checked the generator, unloaded my food into the cooler, and filled a few jugs of water from the tank. I lit a lantern as it got dark and sat on the porch, listening to the quiet. No cars, no humming electronics, no voices, just wind in the trees. The first night was peaceful. I read for a while, made a sandwich, and went to bed early. The cot was uncomfortable, but I was too tired to care. In the middle of the night, I woke up once to use the bathroom. I stepped outside for a minute and looked up at the stars. They were clearer than I'd ever seen. No light pollution, no sound except a few insects and the rustle of leaves. I went back to sleep and woke up feeling better than I had in months. The next 2 days were more of the same. I spent my time walking through the woods around the cabin, gathering small branches to keep the wood stove going, and sitting out by the creek nearby. I didn't see a single person or hear anything unnatural. It was what I wanted, time alone, time to think. But on the fourth night, something changed. It started with a sound. Just after sunset, I was sitting inside reading when I heard it. Something moving outside. It wasn't an animal. I had gotten used to the sounds of raccoons, squirrels, birds, and even a deer passing through. This was slower, heavier. Footsteps, maybe, but too quiet and spaced out. I turned off the lantern and listened. Nothing. Then a few minutes later, I heard it again. Closer this time, moving through the brush behind the cabin. I stayed still. My heart was pounding. I reminded myself that it could still be an animal, maybe a bear, but it didn't move like a bear. It moved like someone walking slowly, carefully. I waited for over an hour in the dark. The footsteps didn't come back. I finally turned the lantern back on and forced myself to act normal. I locked the door and windows, though I doubted those thin latches would do much. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the light off and sat by the window, staring out into the trees. Every time the wind rustled the leaves, I tensed up, but nothing happened. By morning, I started to convince myself I imagined it. Maybe I had spooked myself. Maybe I was hearing things. Later that day, I walked a wide loop around the cabin. I didn't see anything unusual, no tracks, no signs of someone else being out there. But I noticed something strange. About 200 yards from the cabin, deep in the woods, I found a shirt hanging on a low branch. It was old, faded, and torn. It looked like it had been there for a while, but not long enough to fall apart. I didn't touch it. I just stared at it, feeling a deep sense of unease. I didn't remember seeing it before. I turned around and went back to the cabin. That night, I locked everything again and kept the lantern on longer. I tried to read, but I kept checking the windows. I finally shut off the light and laid down, hoping I'd fall asleep. Around midnight, I heard the footsteps again. This time, they circled the cabin. Slow, deliberate. I froze. I didn't move. I just listened. They stopped by the front door. Then nothing. I waited for what felt like hours. I didn't dare move or even breathe too loudly. I stared at the door until morning. As soon as the sky lightened, I got up and looked outside. No footprints, but the door handle had smudges on it, like someone had tried to open it with dirty hands. I knew I wasn't imagining it now. Someone was out there. I considered leaving that day, but I talked myself out of it. I only had a couple of days left. I didn't want to look weak. I figured I'd just be more careful. I took out the hatchet I had brought for chopping firewood and kept it close. I kept the generator off at night so there wouldn't be any noise. I even stacked some firewood inside the front door so it couldn't be opened easily without making a racket. That night, it got worse. Just after midnight, I heard something hit the side of the cabin. Not hard, but like someone tapping. Then again. Then the sound of something being dragged across the porch. My heart was racing. I held the hatchet and crouched behind the couch. I didn't move. The noises continued for about 15 minutes. Then silence. In the morning, I opened the door and saw deep scratches along the wood of the porch. The railing was broken, and in the middle of the porch was a pile of rocks. Small ones, arranged in a circle. I didn't understand what it meant, but it made my skin crawl. I decided I was leaving that day. I packed everything quickly, threw it all in the truck, and didn't even bother organizing it. I started the engine and began backing down the long dirt road. That's when I saw it. At the edge of the woods, maybe 50 feet off the road, stood a man. He wasn't moving. He just stood there, half hidden behind a tree. He was wearing dark clothes and no shoes. His face was pale. I couldn't make out his features, but I knew he was watching me. I didn't stop. I didn't look again. I just drove. I didn't stop until I hit the main road. I drove 3 hours straight before pulling over at a gas station. I sat there for a while, shaking. I didn't know who that man was or what he wanted, but I knew he had been out there for days, watching, waiting. When I got home, I reported it to the owner of the cabin. They didn't respond. The listing disappeared a few days later. I searched for anything about the place online. News, reports, anything, but found nothing. It was like it didn't exist anymore. I never went back to the woods after that. I moved a few months later to a new city, somewhere busier, louder, with people always around. I still think about that trip sometimes, about what could have happened if I hadn't left when I did. I don't know who that man was or why he was out there, but I know I was being hunted. That week was supposed to be peaceful, a break, but it turned into something else, something I'll never forget. I don't tell many people about it because it sounds like something out of a horror movie, but it wasn't. It was real, and it could happen to anyone who thinks they're alone out there. Now I always double-check locks. I avoid remote areas, and I never go anywhere without telling someone where I'm going. Because the truth is, you never know who or what is out in those woods watching you from the trees. It was late September when I decided to take a break from everything and head up to a remote cabin in the mountains of western Montana. I had found the place through a private owner who listed it on a small rental website. It wasn't advertised like the others. There were only a few pictures, just enough to show a single-story wooden structure, a fire pit, a woodpile, and a small creek nearby. It was a few hours from the nearest town and even further from any paved road. That's exactly what I wanted. I packed my truck with enough supplies to last 2 weeks. Canned food, bottled water, coffee, a heavy-duty flashlight, spare batteries, first aid kit, extra clothes, a hatchet, 2 knives, and a shotgun for safety. I also brought a few books, some paper, and pens. I didn't plan to rely on my phone, but I brought it in case of emergencies. There wouldn't be service out there anyway. The drive took most of the day. Once I got off the main road, the trail to the cabin was barely wide enough for my truck. It wound through thick forest, over shallow streams, and up rocky paths. I had to get out twice to move fallen branches. Finally, just as the sun was starting to dip below the tree line, I saw the cabin. It looked exactly like the pictures. Small, weathered, simple. There was no one for miles. I parked beside the fire pit, unloaded the essentials, and stepped inside. The cabin smelled of old pine wood and smoke. It had one main room with a wood stove in the corner, a small kitchenette with a hand pump for water, and a narrow hallway that led to a single bedroom and a cramped bathroom. There was no electricity. I had a couple of propane lanterns to use at night. The first few days were peaceful. I woke up early, made coffee on the gas burner, read books by the creek, and wrote a little. I chopped firewood, cooked simple meals, and spent hours sitting on the porch, just watching the forest. The silence was thick but comforting. It felt like I had stepped outside the world. Around the 5th day, I started noticing small things that made me uneasy. Nothing obvious, just little changes. The pile of firewood I had stacked seemed slightly off, like someone had moved a few pieces. One morning, I found a long scratch on the side of my truck. It wasn't there before. It looked like it was made by something metal. I told myself it was probably a tree branch, or maybe I'd done it myself without realizing. But I couldn't shake the feeling. That night, I heard something walking around outside. It was after midnight. I had been reading by lantern and had just turned it off. I was lying in bed, eyes closed, when I heard footsteps on the gravel near the porch. Not an animal. Too heavy, too deliberate. I sat up and listened. The steps stopped, then started again, slower this time, like someone trying not to make noise. I got out of bed and went to the window, staying low. I couldn't see anything in the dark. I thought about turning on the flashlight, but I didn't want to give away my position. I waited. After a minute, the footsteps stopped again. I stayed by the window for almost an hour. Nothing. Finally, I crawled back into bed, but I didn't sleep much. The next day, I checked around the cabin. There were no fresh tracks, but the ground was dry and covered in leaves. It would have been easy for someone to move around without leaving prints. I looked at the firewood again. 3 pieces were missing. I hadn't used any since the day before. That afternoon, I walked a half-mile radius around the cabin. I didn't see anyone, but I found something strange. About 20 minutes from the cabin, I saw a tree with fresh bark peeled off one side. Long vertical strips, deep gouges, like someone had used a knife or a hatchet. At the base of the tree were 2 empty food wrappers. Not mine. I hadn't brought that brand. It made my stomach tighten. I walked back quickly and stayed close to the cabin the rest of the day. I kept the shotgun loaded and within reach. I didn't use the lantern that night. I stayed awake, listening. I didn't hear anything, but I couldn't relax. I kept imagining someone just outside the window, watching. The next morning, I found something that made my heart sink. On the porch, nailed to the far post, was a small strip of red cloth. It hadn't been there before. It looked like it was torn from a flannel shirt. The nail was rusty, like it had been reused. Whoever did it had taken their time. I decided I needed to leave. I packed my gear and loaded the truck. But when I turned the key, the engine sputtered and died. I tried again. Same thing. I popped the hood. I'm not a mechanic, but I know the basics. The battery cables were loose. Not just loose, unscrewed. Someone had done it deliberately. I reconnected them and tightened the clamps. The truck started on the 3rd try. I backed up fast, turned around, and took off down the trail. My hands were shaking. I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting someone to run out from the woods. When I got back to town, I stopped at a gas station and called the local sheriff. I explained what happened. They took it seriously, sent someone up to check the cabin. A week later, I got a call. They found signs that someone had been living nearby. An old campsite with recent ashes, food wrappers, a few tools, but no person. They said it wasn't the first report like that. Others had felt watched, found things moved, gear tampered with. Whoever it was, they were careful. Never got caught. I haven't gone back to the cabin since. I think about it sometimes, the quiet, the forest, the peace I felt those first few days. But then I remember the footsteps, the missing wood, the red cloth. And I know I was lucky. I got out before anything worse happened. Now, when I take trips, I stay in places with neighbors. Places with locks that work and cell signal. I still love the woods. I just don't go alone anymore. I rented the cabin at Braxton Hill for 3 nights in early October. I needed a break from the city. I'd been feeling burned out. My job, the noise, the constant emails, and the back-to-back meetings were making me feel like I was always stuck in this loop of half sleep and half work. I hadn't taken a real vacation in over 2 years. The cabin was supposed to be my way of resetting things. I found it through an online listing. It wasn't fancy or modern. It was just a small wooden cabin tucked in the mountains, 2 hours from the nearest town and 30 minutes from any paved road. That's what I wanted. No neighbors, no traffic, no internet. The pictures showed a wooden deck, a little fire pit, and a single bedroom with a worn-out sofa. It had solar power and a water tank. The listing said it was built by a hunter in the 70s and updated just enough to be livable. There was no cell service, but I figured I'd be fine for 3 days. The day I left, I packed my SUV with groceries, a few books, a cooler full of food and drinks, a flashlight, a basic first aid kit, and my old hiking boots. I also brought a small generator and a jerry can of fuel, just in case the solar setup failed. I had my phone even though I knew it wouldn't get signal. I also brought my .38 revolver, which I kept locked in a case. I didn't expect to use it, but I always took it on remote trips. The drive took longer than I expected. The last stretch of road was a steep, narrow dirt path full of potholes and washed-out spots. The GPS had stopped working after I passed the last gas station an hour earlier, and I had to rely on the printout I'd made from the map on the listing. That turned out to be a good idea. By the time I pulled up in front of the cabin, it was past 4 p.m., and the sun was starting to dip behind the ridge. The place looked just like the pictures. It sat on a little rise above a sloped clearing, with tall pine trees ringing it from behind. There was a rusty grill outside, an old wooden picnic table, and a small shed with a padlock on the door. The cabin had one window in front and 2 smaller ones on the sides. The front door had a deadbolt and a sliding latch. There were no signs of anyone else for miles. Inside, it smelled like wood and dust. The floor creaked under my boots. There was a single bed pushed into the back corner, a small propane stove in the kitchenette, and a solar-powered battery box mounted on the wall beside the front door. The fridge was small, more like a cooler with a fan inside, but it worked. I turned on the lights, they flickered a bit but stayed on. After unpacking my food and supplies, I sat outside on the deck and watched the light fade behind the trees. The silence was total. No cars, no people, no hum of electricity. Just whined through the branches and the occasional call of a bird. I started to feel the tension in my shoulders ease for the first time in months. That night, I slept hard. I woke once around 2 a.m. because the wind had picked up and was whistling around the eaves, but I fell back asleep quickly. The second day was calm. I made eggs and toast on the propane stove, then hiked a short trail behind the cabin. It wasn't well marked, but I followed it for about a mile to a rocky overlook. The view was incredible, nothing but forest stretching out in every direction, with the narrow dirt road winding through it like a pale scar. When I got back, I sat outside and read until the sun started going down. That night, I made a small fire in the pit and cooked a couple of sausages. The stars were out, brighter than I'd seen in years. The Milky Way stretched overhead like a path of crushed glass. I felt good, alone but not lonely. I turned in around 10 p.m. The next morning, I decided to hike farther down the trail. I took a small pack with a sandwich, 2 bottles of water, a flashlight, and my folding knife. I had my compass and map too. I planned to be back before dark. The trail faded about 2 miles in. I followed what looked like an old deer path downhill into a shallow gully. The forest felt denser there, quieter. I realized I hadn't seen any animals. No squirrels, no deer, not even birds. Just wind. I didn't think much of it at the time. It was when I turned back that I noticed something was off. The trail didn't look the same. I walked uphill, retracing my steps, but nothing looked familiar. I followed the compass, but the ridge ahead didn't match what I remembered. I tried not to panic. I told myself I had plenty of time before dark. After nearly an hour of wandering, I finally found the path again. At least, I thought it was the same one. It had fresh boot prints in the dirt, but they didn't match mine. The sole pattern was different, wider, heavier. I knelt to look closer. There were 2 sets, spaced apart like 2 people had walked side by side. I hadn't seen anyone since leaving town. I stood up and looked around. The forest felt still in a strange way. I turned and walked quickly, following the prints for a short distance until they veered off toward a thicket. I stopped and listened. Nothing. No footsteps. No voices. No animals. Just wind. I made it back to the cabin before sunset. Everything looked the same, but I still felt unsettled. I checked the door and windows. Still locked. I went inside and pulled the revolver from its case. I didn't load it, just kept it nearby. That night, I didn't sleep well. Every creak of the cabin made my ears twitch. I turned off the lights and sat in the dark for a long time, listening. Around midnight, I heard something outside, a soft crunch of leaves. Then another. Slow steps. Not an animal. Too spaced out. Too steady. I held my breath. The footsteps circled the cabin once, then stopped near the back window. I stayed frozen. The steps didn't come closer. No knocking. No voices. I waited for what felt like an hour before the sounds faded. At dawn, I went outside. I found boot prints behind the cabin. Same wide soles I'd seen on the trail. They led from the trees to the back window and then around to the other side. They disappeared into the forest. No tire tracks. No other signs. I packed my gear in a hurry. I didn't want to stay another night. I had planned to leave in the morning anyway, but I didn't want to wait. The generator was untouched. The cabin was locked. Nothing was missing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching. I loaded up the SUV, double-checked everything, and started the engine. The drive back down the mountain was slow. The road was narrow and winding, with sharp turns and loose gravel. I kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see someone walking along the shoulder, but there was nothing. After about 30 minutes of driving, I came to a spot where a tree had fallen across the road. It wasn't huge, but it was thick enough to block my path. I got out to check it. The brake was fresh. The leaves were still green, and the trunk was damp and splintered. I looked up and around. The slope above the road was steep but stable. The tree hadn't fallen naturally. Someone had cut it. The cut wasn't clean like a chainsaw would make. It was uneven, done with a hand tool, maybe an axe. I walked a few yards up the road to see if I could turn around, but there wasn't enough space. The shoulder dropped off sharply. I'd have to clear the tree. I opened the back of the SUV and pulled out the small hatchet I kept in the emergency kit. It wasn't much, but it was sharp. I started hacking at the thinner branches, trying to clear a path wide enough to drive over or around the trunk. I kept checking the trees behind me. After about 20 minutes of chopping, I heard something snap deeper in the woods. Not a branch falling, more like a step, then another, then silence. I turned slowly, trying not to make noise. I didn't see anything. The forest was dense and shadowed, but I knew someone was there. I didn't want to run. I kept working on the tree, moving faster. Every few minutes, I stopped to listen. The steps would start again, closer each time. I couldn't tell if it was one person or more. Finally, I got the branches cleared enough to drive over the base of the trunk. I sprinted to the SUV, started it, and drove forward, wheels bumping over the rough bark. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I hit the main road an hour later. I kept driving past the gas station, past the diner, all the way to the next town. I found a motel and checked in. I stayed there for 2 days. I didn't go back to the cabin. I didn't tell anyone what happened. A week later, I got a message from the owner of the listing. She asked why I hadn't left the key in the drop box. I didn't reply. 2 months later, the listing was taken down. I needed to get away. After months of relentless work and personal turmoil, solitude seemed like the remedy. I found a secluded cabin online, nestled deep within the woods, miles away from the nearest town. The listing boasted of tranquility, a place to disconnect and rejuvenate. It was perfect. The drive was long, winding through narrow roads that gradually turned into gravel paths. The dense forest enveloped the route, sunlight filtering through the canopy in patches. Upon arrival, the cabin stood modestly amidst towering trees, its wooden exterior weathered but sturdy. There was no cell service, no Wi-Fi, exactly what I wanted. Inside, the cabin was simple. A small kitchen, a living area with a fireplace, a bedroom, and a bathroom. I unpacked, stocked the fridge with supplies, and settled in. The first day was uneventful. I read a book, took a walk, and enjoyed the silence. That night, the forest sounds lulled me to sleep. The next morning, I ventured deeper into the woods, following a trail that looped back to the cabin. The air was crisp, birds chirped, and the serenity was palpable. However, as I returned, I noticed something odd. A set of footprints leading away from the cabin. They weren't mine. I brushed it off, attributing it to a hiker or perhaps an animal. But unease settled in. That night, I locked the doors and windows, a precaution I hadn't considered necessary before. Atmosphere pressed a calm. 1. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by a noise, a soft thud from the porch. I held my breath, listening. Another thud, followed by the creak of the wooden steps. I quietly moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. Nothing. The forest was still. The following day, I found scratches on the back door, as if someone or something had tried to get in. Panic set in. I considered leaving but reminded myself that I came here to escape, to find peace. Couldn't let fear drive me away. I spent the day reinforcing the doors and windows, creating makeshift barricades. That night, I stayed awake, armed with a fireplace poker, ears attuned to every sound. Hours passed in silence until a sudden bang echoed from the back of the cabin. I rushed to the kitchen, heart pounding, and saw the back door ajar. I slammed it shut, securing it with a chair. Sleep was impossible. At dawn, I decided to leave. I packed hastily, but when I tried to start my car, it wouldn't turn over. I checked under the hood, wires had been cut. Someone had sabotaged it. Stranded, I weighed my options. The nearest town was miles away, but staying felt increasingly dangerous. I gathered essentials, a flashlight, and set out on foot, following the road that brought me here. Hours passed. The sun dipped below the horizon, and darkness enveloped the forest. I pressed on, flashlight flickering, until I saw headlights in the distance. I waved frantically, and a truck slowed to a stop. The driver, a middle-aged man, looked concerned. I explained my situation, and he offered to take me to the nearest town. Relief washed over me. At the local sheriff's office, I recounted everything. They dispatched a deputy to investigate. Later, I learned that the cabin had been used by squatters in the past, and there were reports of suspicious activities in the area. My experience wasn't unique. I returned home, grateful to be safe. The tranquility I sought had turned into a nightmare, but it taught me to trust my instincts. Solitude can be healing, but isolation can also be perilous. The cabin was a modest structure, built decades ago by a retired carpenter. It had a rustic charm, weathered wooden walls, a stone fireplace, and a porch that overlooked a serene lake. The nearest town was over an hour's drive away, and the dirt road leading to the cabin was barely more than a trail. But that isolation was exactly what I was seeking. I arrived in late September, just as the leaves were turning. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. Unpacking my supplies, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in years. The first few days were idyllic. I spent my time hiking, reading, and sitting by the lake, letting the tranquility wash over me. On the fourth night, I was awakened by a noise. It was subtle at first, a faint rustling outside the cabin. I dismissed it as wildlife and drifted back to sleep. But the next night, the noise returned, louder and more deliberate. It sounded like footsteps circling the cabin. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, straining to hear. After a few tense minutes, the sound ceased. Reddit.com 3. The following morning, I inspected the area around the cabin. The ground was covered in fallen leaves, making it difficult to discern any tracks. I reassured myself that it was probably a deer or some other animal. Still, I couldn't shake the unease that had settled over me. That evening, I decided to keep the porch light on. As darkness enveloped the woods, I sat by the fireplace, trying to focus on my book. Around midnight, the footsteps returned, slow, deliberate, and unmistakably human. I froze, every muscle tense. The steps moved around the cabin, pausing occasionally, as if the person was listening or watching. I didn't dare move, fearing that any sound would reveal my presence. Eventually, the footsteps faded into the distance. I waited until dawn before venturing outside. This time, I found footprints, boot prints, leading from the woods to the cabin and back again. They were fresh, the impressions crisp in the damp earth. Panic set in. Someone had been watching me. Reddit.com 3. I considered leaving immediately, but the thought of driving through the dense forest at night was daunting. Instead, I decided to stay one more night, ensuring I left at first light. I barricaded the doors and windows, kept a fire burning, and sat with a flashlight and a kitchen knife by my side. The night was eerily silent. No footsteps, no rustling, just the crackling of the fire and the occasional hoot of an owl. I didn't sleep, my eyes fixed on the door, ears attuned to every sound. When dawn broke, I packed my belongings hastily and left the cabin without looking back. Back in the city, I reported the incident to the local authorities. They investigated but found no signs of forced entry or any evidence pointing to an intruder. The case was closed without resolution. To this day, I don't know who was out there or what they wanted, but the experience left an indelible mark on me. I still seek solitude, but now, I choose places where help isn't hours away. The woods are beautiful, but they can also be haunting, especially when you're truly alone. It started with the idea of getting away from everything. I wanted to leave the noise and rush of city life behind for a while and just breathe. I picked a small cabin deep in the woods, far from any towns or highways. The listing said it was isolated, quiet, and surrounded by nature. Perfect, I thought. No distractions, no people, just me and the forest. The drive there was longer than I expected. The last stretch was on a narrow, bumpy dirt road that twisted through thick trees. The sun was dropping low by the time I finally pulled up to the cabin. It was a simple wooden structure, weathered but sturdy. There was no cell phone signal, just as promised. I parked the car and stepped out, the smell of pine and earth filling the air. The cabin sat in a small clearing, with tall trees all around like silent sentries. The porch was old but solid, with a couple of creaky chairs. There was a woodpile stacked against the sidewall and a stone fire pit in front of the porch. The windows were dusty, but inside looked clean and tidy from what I could see. I unlocked the door with the old-fashioned key left in the lockbox and stepped inside. The cabin was small, maybe 2 rooms plus a bathroom. The main room had a small kitchen area with basic appliances: a fridge, a stove, a sink, and a dining table with a few chairs. There was a wood stove in one corner and a small couch with a coffee table in front of it. I set my bag down and took a deep breath. The air inside smelled faintly of old wood and something else, like damp earth or moss. I liked it, I lit the stove to warm the room, then went to unpack some food and water I had brought with me. No internet, no TV, no radio. Just silence, except for the occasional creak of the cabin settling. After a quick dinner, I sat on the porch with a flashlight and a book. The forest was dark now, thick shadows between the trees. The wind rustled the leaves softly, and somewhere in the distance, I heard a faint howl, maybe a coyote or a fox. The night felt different out here. Still, it was peaceful. I checked the windows and doors before heading to bed. The cabin had locks on the doors, but no alarm or anything like that. I wasn't worried about burglars or anything, but I made sure everything was secure anyway. I set the flashlight by the bed and turned off the lights. The bed was small and a little stiff, but comfortable enough. I lay down, listening to the sounds outside. The wind picked up, and the branches scraped softly against the roof. I tried to clear my mind and fall asleep. That's when I first noticed the noise. It was a faint scratching sound, like nails dragging lightly on wood. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a squirrel trying to get at the woodpile. But the sound was steady and slow, coming from the side of the cabin, just outside the wall next to the bed. I held my breath and stayed still, trying to tell if it was something to worry about. The scratching continued for a few minutes, then stopped. I waited, but nothing else happened. Eventually, I convinced myself it was nothing and drifted off. The next morning, I went outside to check the side of the cabin. The woodpile looked untouched. There were some scratches on the logs, but nothing new or unusual. The ground was soft from recent rain, and I didn't see any footprints or tracks near the cabin. I spent the day exploring the nearby trails. The forest was dense and green, with tall fir trees and thick underbrush. Birds sang overhead, and small animals darted through the bushes. I felt good being alone with nature. Back at the cabin in the evening, I built a fire in the stone pit and roasted some food on a stick. The sky was clear and full of stars. The quiet was comforting, but also strange in a way. There was no hum of cars, no distant voices, just the sounds of the forest. I went inside early to warm up and get ready for bed. That night, the scratching returned. This time it was louder, closer. It was coming from the woodpile again, right outside the window by the kitchen. I grabbed the flashlight and shone it outside. For a moment, I thought I saw movement near the logs. A quick shadow that disappeared as I moved the beam. My heart beat faster, but I told myself it was an animal. I stayed awake for a long time, listening. After a while, the scratching stopped, and everything went quiet. The next day, I checked the woodpile again. There were fresh claw marks on some of the logs, deep, uneven scratches like from an animal's claws. The marks were old enough to have dried, but fresh enough to be new since I arrived. I took a closer look around the clearing and noticed something else. Broken branches and flattened grass near the edge of the trees. It looked like something large had passed through recently. A slow, sinking feeling grew in my stomach. I had expected peace and quiet here, not signs that something big and wild was nearby. I spent the day making sure the cabin was secure. I moved the woodpile closer to the cabin wall and stacked it more tightly, trying to reduce hiding spots. I checked all the windows, locking them securely. That night, the noises were worse. The scratching started again, followed by a low, guttural growl from outside. It wasn't a coyote or fox. This was something bigger, something closer. I sat up in bed, flashlight in hand, shining it out the window. The beam caught something moving in the shadows, a large shape slipping between the trees. My breath caught. I remembered the stories I'd heard about bears and mountain lions in the area. I'd never seen one before, but now I was realizing how close I might be to one. The thought made my skin crawl. I didn't sleep much that night. Every sound made me jump. The snapping of a twig, the rustling of leaves, the distant call of a bird. I kept the flashlight by my side, ready to shine it outside if needed. The next morning, I found more evidence of the creature. Near the porch, there were large paw prints pressed deep into the mud. They were too big for a dog or coyote. The prints led into the woods, then circled back toward the cabin. Something was watching me. I knew I couldn't stay outside after dark. The idea of the cabin being my safe place felt shaky now. I spent the day preparing. I gathered all the firewood I could find and stacked it inside, near the stove. I cleaned the kitchen, cleared the porch, and made sure nothing outside would attract animals. No food scraps, no open containers. I thought about leaving, but the nearest town was more than an hour away, and the road back was rough. Plus, I didn't want to give up after just one night. The next evening, as the sun set, the noises began again. Scratching, growling, pacing around the cabin. The creature was circling. I stayed inside, sitting by the stove with a heavy metal poker in my hands. I listened as something large brushed against the cabin walls, scratching at the wood, trying to get in. At one point, the porch light flickered and went out. The sudden darkness was frightening. I flicked on my flashlight and shone it outside. In the beam, I saw two bright eyes staring back at me from the edge of the clearing. The eyes didn't blink or move away. They just watched. I felt frozen. The creature stepped closer, just outside the light. It was massive, probably a bear or a large mountain lion. Its fur was dark and matted, and its muscles moved under the skin with terrifying strength. The creature scratched at the doorframe, growling low. I gripped the poker tighter. Hours passed like this. The creature stayed close, never leaving the clearing. It paced back and forth, scratching, growling, sometimes hitting the cabin walls with its massive paws. I didn't dare sleep. I stayed awake, trying to stay calm, telling myself it wouldn't break in. I didn't want to move or make noise. As dawn finally approached, the creature retreated slowly into the woods. I heard it move away, deeper into the trees. The clearing grew quiet again. I was exhausted but relieved. That morning, I packed up everything quickly. I didn't want to stay a second longer. The thought of spending another night with that creature circling the cabin was unbearable. I locked the cabin, double-checked the doors, and started the car. The dirt road back felt like a lifeline. On the drive home, I thought about what had happened. The forest was beautiful, but it was wild and dangerous. The cabin was not a safe refuge. It was a small wooden box in the middle of an animal's territory. No amount of locks or flashlights could change that. I realized that sometimes getting away from it all meant facing something much bigger than I'd expected. I decided I wouldn't try this kind of isolation again. Not like that, anyway. When I got back to town, I called the rental agency and told them I was done with the cabin. They understood, but I knew I wouldn't be back. Now, whenever I think about that trip, I remember the silence and the shadows, the heavy breathing just outside the walls, and the way the eyes watched me through the dark. It was a reminder that nature isn't always peaceful or friendly. Sometimes, it's a force that humbles you, forcing you to respect its rules. And I did. I still remember that trip like it was yesterday, even though it happened years ago. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway, just me and my backpack, heading into the woods for some peace and quiet. I wanted to disconnect from everything. No phones, no internet, no people. Just the forest, a small cabin I rented, and myself. I never imagined how much that weekend would change the way I think about being alone in the wild. The cabin was tucked deep in the woods of a national forest far from any town or paved road. The drive-in was long and bumpy, gravel paths with potholes and overgrown branches scraping the sides of my car. When I finally got to the parking spot, the sun was already starting to lower in the sky. The place was quiet, too quiet. No birds singing, no wind rustling through the leaves, nothing. Just a still silence that felt heavy. The cabin itself looked old but sturdy. It was made of thick logs with a small porch, a rusty old lantern hanging by the door, and a chimney that didn't seem to have been used in a while. There was no electricity, no running water, just a pump outside and a small wood stove inside. Exactly what I wanted. The owner had warned me to bring everything I needed because there was no store for miles. I unpacked my bag slowly, taking my time to get everything in order. I stacked firewood near the stove, filled the water jug from the pump, and checked my supplies. I had canned food, dry snacks, a first aid kit, plenty of water, a flashlight, extra batteries, and a map of the area. I had planned to hike during the day, maybe explore a bit, and come back before dark. The first night was cold. I built a fire in the stove and warmed up the small cabin. The wood crackled and popped as it burned. I ate a simple meal from my canned food, drank some water, and tried to read a book by the firelight. But the silence was oppressive. Felt like the forest was watching, waiting. I kept thinking I heard faint sounds outside, twigs snapping, leaves rustling. But when I looked out the window, all I saw was darkness and the dense trees. I told myself it was just my imagination, maybe animals moving around, or the wind picking up. Still, I found myself checking the locks on the door more than once, even though it was just a tiny cabin in the middle of nowhere. I set my flashlight next to my bed, just in case. Sleep was hard to come by that night. The next morning, I woke early. The sun was filtering through the trees, casting long shadows on the forest floor. I made coffee on the stove and planned a hike to a nearby river I had seen on the map. The air smelled fresh and earthy, mixed with pine and damp leaves. Birds had returned, and the sounds of the forest came alive again. For a while, I felt safe. I followed a narrow trail, stepping carefully over roots and stones. The forest was thick, with tall trees and ferns covering the ground. I noticed how quickly the trail disappeared behind me once I was deep inside. It was easy to lose your way if you weren't paying attention. After about 2 hours, I reached the river. It was small but clear, the water running cold and fast over smooth rocks. I sat by the edge, dipping my fingers in the chilly water. I stayed there a while, just listening to the rushing water and the wind through the leaves. That's when I first noticed something was off. I spotted footprints on the muddy bank. They were fresh, like someone had been there recently. I looked around, but the forest seemed empty. No sign of anyone else, no campsites, no trash, nothing. I told myself it was probably a hiker or camper passing through. I wasn't worried, but a little voice in the back of my mind told me to be careful. I stayed for a few more minutes and then headed back to the cabin. The trail felt narrower on the return trip, shadows growing longer as the sun dipped behind the trees. I kept hearing sounds, little cracks and snaps, something moving just out of sight. My heart beat faster, but I forced myself to stay calm. I knew the forest could play tricks on you. When I got back to the cabin, the sun was almost gone. I locked the door, shut the windows, and tried to make myself feel safe. I cooked a quick dinner and sat by the fire again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, the sounds outside grew louder. It wasn't the usual forest noises. Something was moving around the cabin. I could hear footsteps crunching on dry leaves, circling the building slowly. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it through the window, but the woods looked empty. I didn't sleep at all. I kept the fire burning bright and stayed awake, listening. The footsteps stopped around midnight, but started again a little while later. They never came too close, but I knew something was out there, watching me. The next day, I packed a bag quickly. I decided I wouldn't stay the whole weekend anymore. I didn't want to be trapped alone with whatever was lurking in those woods. I checked the perimeter of the cabin during the daylight and found something unsettling. Scratches on the wooden walls, deep and fresh, like someone or something had tried to claw their way inside. I took pictures with my phone, hoping to show someone later, but there was no signal at the cabin at all. I felt trapped. The nearest road was miles away, and the only way out was the same trail I had come in on. I planned my escape carefully. I would leave early before dawn when it was still dark, but before anything outside became active again. I didn't want to see whoever or whatever had been making those noises. That night was the worst. I barely moved, clutching my flashlight and a hunting knife I found in the cabin's small storage closet. Every sound made me jump: the wind, the branches, the occasional animal calls. I didn't know what to expect. At one point, I heard a heavy thud against the side of the cabin. It sounded like something big. My heart stopped. I aimed the flashlight toward the noise but saw nothing. I didn't dare open the door. I waited, frozen, until dawn finally broke. The sun rose slowly, bathing the forest in soft orange light. The noises stopped as daylight filled the trees. I took a deep breath, grabbed my bag, and stepped outside. The scratches were still there, fresh and angry looking. I didn't look back. The walk back was tense and slow. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. The trail was quiet, eerily so. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. It was as if the forest was holding its breath. When I finally reached my car, I locked the doors and sat inside for a long time, trying to calm down. The relief was overwhelming. I started the engine and drove away, not daring to stop until I was on a paved road. Back in town, I reported what happened to the forest rangers. They said it might have been someone living illegally in the woods, a squatter or a hunter who didn't want visitors. They took my pictures of the scratches and footprints but couldn't promise anything. I never went back to that cabin or those woods. The experience left me shaken. I realized that sometimes the scariest things aren't ghosts or monsters, but people who choose to live on the edge of society, where the rules don't apply. The feeling of being watched, hunted, and trapped in the middle of nowhere was real, and it haunted me long after I left. That weekend taught me that nature can be unforgiving and that humans can be even more dangerous when they want to be. I learned to respect the wild, but also to be cautious of what might be hiding inside it. I still camp and hike sometimes, but I always make sure I'm not alone, and I never go off the beaten path without someone knowing exactly where I am. The forest is a beautiful place, but it has its shadows, and sometimes those shadows belong to people, not spirits. And that, to me, is the real terror.